She was worth $4 billion, and she was standing in the rain like she had nowhere to go. That was the first thing Ethan Brooks noticed. Not the designer suit soaked through to the skin, not the luxury sedan sitting dead on the shoulder of Route 9 like an expensive piece of sculpture, not even the way she kept jabbing at her phone with shaking fingers while lightning split the sky open somewhere behind the tree line. He noticed that she looked completely, utterly alone. The kind of alone that had nothing to do with being stranded on a dark road in a thunderstorm. He'd seen that look before. He saw it in the mirror every morning. Nobody that night could have predicted what that broken-down car would set in motion. Least of all Ethan, who was just trying to get his daughter home before she fell asleep in the back seat. One act of ordinary decency. One stranger in the rain. And a life that would never look the same again. If you've ever believed that the smallest choices carry the heaviest weight, stay with me. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit like. And let's begin. The rain started around 6:30, which meant Ethan Brooks was already behind. He'd promised Sophie they'd leave the diner by 6. He'd promised her chocolate cake for finishing her green beans. He'd promised her they'd be home in time to watch the animated movie she'd been talking about since Monday. The one about the dog who crosses the country alone to find its family, which Sophie had described to him in exhaustive detail 3 separate times, as though each retelling might finally convince him it was the greatest film ever made. He'd kept exactly one of those promises. The cake. "Dad," Sophie's voice came from the back seat, small and pointed, the way 8-year-olds could make their voices when they were calculating exactly how much trouble they were willing to cause. "You said 6. I know what I said. It's 6:42. I know what time it is, Soph. The movie starts at 7:15. We'll make it." "You always say that." Ethan glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. She had chocolate on her chin that she hadn't bothered to wipe off, and she was holding her stuffed rabbit, Biscuit, who had been through more laundering cycles than most adults' wardrobes, with the specific grip of a child who was trying very hard not to fall asleep. Her eyes were doing that slow blink thing they did when sleep was winning and stubbornness was losing. "You're going to be asleep before the opening credits," he said. "I'm not." $10. "I don't have $10. "Then you can owe me." She made a sound that was somewhere between a scoff and a yawn, which pretty much settled the argument. The tow truck moved through the dark on Route 9, wipers working overtime against rain that had been getting progressively more serious since they'd pulled out of the diner parking lot. Ethan had the heater going, which meant the cab smelled like motor oil and warm plastic, the specific scent of his life for the past 6 years. He'd started apologizing for it once, to a woman he'd briefly dated about 2 years back, and she'd held up a hand and said, "I know what I signed up for," in a tone that made it clear she actually did not know what she'd signed up for, and 3 weeks later she'd stopped returning his calls. He wasn't bitter about it. He understood. His life was not a simple thing to step into. The shop, Brooks Auto, a name that had seemed confidently optimistic when he'd painted it above the bay doors 5 years ago, occupied a corner lot off the main commercial strip in Mill Haven, a mid-sized town in Western Virginia that was neither thriving nor dying, existing in that long plateau of modest American ordinariness that most people didn't write songs about. 2 repair bays. 1 hydraulic lift that he'd bought secondhand and rebuilt himself. A waiting room with 3 plastic chairs and a coffee maker that worked about 60% of the time. He'd been meaning to replace it for 2 years. The business kept them alive. Not comfortable. Not ahead. Alive. There were months where Ethan did the math so many times it stopped being math and became a kind of ritual, like worrying beads. Invoicing Tuesday, payroll Friday, rent the first of the month, parts orders whenever he could float them. He knew exactly how many jobs he needed per week to keep Sophie in her school, in her dance class, in the shoes that she outgrew with unreasonable speed. He knew what a slow February could cost them against a strong October. He'd learned to read the gaps in the schedule the way other people read weather, with a specific dread that had become so familiar it almost felt like company. He was good at the work. That was never the problem. His father had taught him engines the way some fathers teach their sons to play catch. With patience, with repetition, with the understanding that competence was a form of dignity. By the time Ethan was 16, he could diagnose a fuel injection issue by sound alone. By 20, he was doing fleet maintenance for 3 small businesses in the county. At 24, he'd borrowed the money to open his own shop. And for a while, for a genuinely beautiful while, things had looked like they might work out exactly the way he'd planned. Then Claire got sick. He didn't think about that part of the story much anymore, or he tried not to. Grief had a way of burrowing in so deep that eventually it stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like architectures, just the shape of the rooms you lived in. Sophie had been 2 when her mother died. She had no memory of Claire except through photographs and the things Ethan told her, and he'd worked very hard to make sure those stories were true and complete, and not just the edited version people tended to construct around someone they'd lost. Claire had been funny and impatient and terrible at parallel parking, and she'd sung to herself while she cooked without realizing she was doing it. She'd argued with Ethan about money constantly. She'd been afraid of moths, specifically moths, which had always struck him as an oddly specific fear. She'd loved Sophie from the first moment with a ferocity that had actually frightened him a little. He told Sophie all of that. He figured she deserved the whole person. The rain was coming harder now. Ethan leaned forward slightly, peering through the windshield at a stretch of road that curved ahead into a dense wall of pine trees, the headlights doing their best and still not doing enough. Sophie had gone quiet in the back seat, which meant she was either asleep or pretending to be asleep to win the argument by technicality. He almost missed it. The car was pulled mostly off the shoulder, a dark shape half swallowed by rain and shadow, its hazard lights blinking a slow orange pulse into the dark. A Bentley Continental. Ethan registered the lines of it automatically, the way he always registered cars, sitting at an angle that said it had rolled to a stop rather than being parked with any intention. The hood wasn't up. There was no emergency triangle, just the car, the rain, and a figure standing beside the driver's door with a phone pressed to their ear, not taking shelter, not moving, just standing there in the storm, like they hadn't quite decided what to do yet. Ethan's foot came off the gas. He told himself later that it was automatic, that any reasonable person would have slowed down. He wasn't wrong, but he also knew that slowing down and actually pulling over were 2 different calculations, and the second one involved factoring in Sophie in the back seat, and the hour, and the rain, and the very full schedule he had starting at 7 the next morning. He pulled over anyway. "Stay here," he said quietly, half to Sophie and half to himself. He checked the mirror. She was out. Genuinely asleep now, biscuit tucked under her chin, mouth slightly open, the argument about the movie dissolved into the deep, uncomplicated sleep of children. He grabbed the flashlight from the glove box, pulled the hood of his jacket up, and opened the door into the rain. It hit him all at once, cold, hard, insistent, the kind of rain that didn't so much fall as arrive, as though it had been building up pressure somewhere above the clouds, and finally lost patience. He crossed the gap between his truck and the stranded car in about 15 seconds, and felt thoroughly soaked in 12 of them. The person standing by the driver's door turned at the beam of his flashlight, and he got his first look at her. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, give or take. Dark hair that had started the evening in some kind of careful arrangement and was now partially dismantled by the rain. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a cream-colored blouse, both of which were saturated, and the expression on her face was the particular combination of frustrated and embarrassed that people wore when they were used to being in control, and a situation had removed that option. "Ma'am," he said, raising his voice over the rain, "you need some help?" She looked at him for a second with the specific wariness of a woman alone on a dark road being approached by a stranger. He understood it. He took a half step back, angled the flashlight away from her face, made himself as non-threatening as a 6-foot man in a wet jacket could plausibly make himself. "The engine just stopped," she said. "I was driving and it just stopped. I've called my driver, but he's 40 minutes out and I have a—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I have somewhere I need to be." "When did it cut out? Did it sputter or did it just die?" She blinked. "It just died all at once." Ethan nodded, moving toward the front of the car. "Mind if I take a look?" She hesitated for exactly 1 second, then moved back and gestured with her hand. "Go ahead." He popped the hood. The flashlight swept across the engine compartment, and it took him less than 90 seconds to find it. The main battery cable had a connector that had corroded to the point where it had simply lost contact, probably vibration from the road, he thought, combined with the weather. The battery was fine, The alternator was fine. The whole car was fine. It just wasn't connected to itself properly. Got a basic toolkit in my truck, he said. This is a 15-minute fix, maybe 20. She was standing next to him now, looking at the engine the way people looked at things they couldn't read but were trying to. Are you serious? Cable connector, corrosion. Give me a few minutes. He jogged back to the truck, careful not to slam the door when he reached in past Sophie to grab the toolbox from behind the seat. She didn't stir. He stood in the rain for a second, watching her sleep. The easy weight of it, the complete surrender. And something in his chest did the thing it sometimes did when he looked at her when she wasn't aware of it. A complicated kind of ache. Love tangled up with worry in a way that never fully separated. He went back to work. The woman, she'd said her name was Scarlett when he'd asked, offered it briefly, like someone who'd learned to give their first name and wait to see what happened, stood nearby without hovering, which he appreciated. Some people narrated while you worked. Is that serious? Is that bad? Is that supposed to look like that? She just watched. When he asked her to hold the light, she held it exactly where he needed it, without asking questions. You do this a lot, she said at one point. Fix cars? For a living? Yeah. I meant stop for strangers. He worked the connector loose, examined the terminal, started cleaning it with the wire brush from his kit. My dad used to say if you drive past somebody who needs help and you could have stopped, that's on you, stays with you. Most people don't operate that way anymore. I know. He didn't say it like a judgment, just as a fact that lived in the same neighborhood as other facts. She was quiet for a moment. What's your daughter's name? He looked up. She'd nodded toward the truck where Sophie's silhouette was just visible through the rain-streaked back window. Sophie, he said. How old? 8. He paused. She's going to be furious when she wakes up and the movie's already started. Something happened in Scarlett's face then. A small, unguarded thing, like a window opening for a second before someone remembered to close it. You were on your way home. We were on our way home, he corrected, not unkindly. It's fine, this won't take long. It took 18 minutes. When the engine turned over, strong and immediate, no hesitation, the car alive again exactly the way it was supposed to be. The sound of it was immediately followed by Scarlett exhaling, a slow release of breath that suggested she'd been holding tension in her body since before she'd gotten in the car that evening. She stood by the open door and looked at him. What do I owe you? Nothing. That's not... She stopped, started again. You stopped in the middle of a rainstorm with your daughter in the car. You worked on my vehicle. I need to pay you. You don't. I want to. Ethan closed the hood, latched it, wiped his hands on a rag that was already wet. He looked at her. In the combined light of the car's running lights and her hazard flashers, he could see the confusion on her face. She was trying to work out the angle, what he wanted, what he was setting up for. There's no catch, he said. Drive safe. It's ugly out there. He turned and walked back toward his truck. Wait. She took a step toward him, then seemed to stop herself, caught between the instinct to chase the loose end and the confusion about what she'd even say if she caught it. At least tell me the name of your shop. I'll bring my car in for service. He glanced back. Brooks Auto. Off Route 9, about 3 miles east on Commerce Street. You can't miss it. He paused. Get home safe, Scarlett. He climbed back into the truck. Sophie was still asleep. The heater was still running. The radio was playing something low and country, one of the old stations he kept on because the music asked nothing of him. Ethan sat for a moment before pulling back onto the road, watching the Bentley's taillights shrink in the rain and then disappear around the curve. Then he put the truck in drive and headed home. He got Sophie inside without fully waking her, which was a logistical achievement that he'd perfected over years of late nights. The specific combination of angle and momentum required to carry a sleeping 8-year-old from a truck to a bed without triggering the waking sequence. She'd grown. The physics were changing. He was going to have to renegotiate the approach. He got her shoes off, pulled the blanket up, set Biscuit in the crook of her arm. She made a sound and turned her face into the pillow. Movie? She murmured. Tomorrow, he said. We'll watch it tomorrow. She was asleep again before the sentence finished. Ethan stood in the doorway for a second, hand on the frame. The room was painted yellow. Sophie had chosen it when she was 5 from a paint chip she'd selected with tremendous seriousness at the hardware store, studying the options the way a jeweler studies stones. The color was aggressive in daylight. At night, in the dark, it was just a room where his daughter slept. He went to the kitchen, made coffee he didn't need but wanted anyway, and stood at the counter going through the stack of invoices he'd been avoiding since Wednesday. The rain was still going outside the window. He could hear it against the glass, a steady percussion. His phone buzzed. A notification from the shop's scheduling app. Someone had booked an appointment for the next morning. Oil change, routine, easy. He confirmed it and set the phone down. He stood there in the kitchen in his damp clothes, drinking bad coffee, looking at numbers that didn't quite add up the way he needed them to, and felt the specific texture of his life settle back around him like a coat he'd worn so long he'd stopped noticing the weight. He didn't think about the woman in the rain, not more than briefly. He thought about Sophie's shoes, which were getting small again. He thought about the compressor in Bay 2, which had started making a sound it shouldn't make. He thought about the water heater, which was 12 years old and operating on borrowed time. He thought about the stack of mail in the basket by the door that he'd been selectively avoiding for 3 days, because some of it required decisions he hadn't made yet. These were the thoughts that lived in the nighttime, when the distractions ran out. He finished the coffee, rinsed the mug, turned off the kitchen light, stood in the dark for a second. Then he went to bed, because there was nothing else to be done and 6 o'clock was going to come whether he was ready for it or not. He was under a Chevy Silverado at 9:45 the next morning, working through a brake job with the radio on and his mind in the particular focused quietness that came from doing something his hands knew completely when he heard tires on the lot gravel. He didn't think much of it. Cars pulled in. That was the whole point. He finished torquing the caliper bolt, slid the creeper out from under the truck, and sat up. There were 2 black SUVs parked on his lot. Not in the service bays, just parked, one behind the other, engines off, tinted windows giving away exactly nothing. Then a third vehicle, a town car, pulling in behind them. Ethan stood up, wiping his hands. Felt the first small note of something that wasn't quite alarm but was adjacent to it. Then the doors opened. The people who got out of the first SUV were not the kind of people who typically visited an independent auto shop on a Tuesday morning in Millhaven, Virginia. 2 of them were large, wearing earpieces, scanning the lot in a way that was professional and completely automatic. Another 2 were carrying tablets and talking to each other in the rapid shorthand of people who had too much to do. A woman in a structured blazer, who radiated organizational authority, stepped out of the town car and said something to someone still inside. And then Scarlett Whitmore stepped out. Ethan didn't recognize her. Not right away. He saw the woman from the rain, same face, same dark hair, though it was pulled back now, and registered that she'd found his shop the way she'd said she might. And he thought, good, she listened. She made it home okay, and was already figuring out what kind of service she might want on the Bentley. Then one of the people with tablets turned and he caught the logo on their badge. Whitmore Industries. And something in his brain performed a rapid, unwilling calculation. He'd seen that logo. He'd seen it on the news, on the business segment Sophie always wanted to change away from. He'd seen it on the article someone had left in his waiting room 3 months back about the youngest self-made female billionaires in the country, which he'd glanced at for 30 seconds before the article was inevitably co-opted by a customer who turned it over to the sports section. The face in that article. Ethan stood very still. Scarlett crossed the lot toward him, and now he could see the slight tension in the way she was holding herself, the awareness that this was a dramatic entrance she hadn't entirely designed but was navigating anyway. 2 of the men with earpieces moved slightly to flank her without appearing to, the choreography of security. She stopped a few feet from him. "Hi," she said. He stared at her for a second. "You're Scarlett Whitmore." "Yes, the Scarlett Whitmore." Something moved across her face. "There's really only the one." He looked at the SUVs, at the people with the tablets, at the woman in the structured blazer who was watching him with the calm, evaluating gaze of someone paid to assess threats. Back at Scarlett. "You drive a Bentley," he said. "I drive several cars. That one happened to be the Bentley last night." Your driver was 40 minutes away. He was. Ethan looked down at his hands, which still had brake dust on them, then back up. I fixed your cable connector. You did, Scarlett said. For free, in a rainstorm, with your daughter asleep in your truck. She paused. I did some research on you last night, Mr. Brooks. That's... He stopped. Considered that. Okay. Brooks Auto, 5 years in business. You have a solid reputation in this county. 4.8 stars on every review platform that exists. You do good work and you charge fair prices, which apparently makes you something of an anomaly. She glanced around the shop, the 2 bays, the lift, the somewhat optimistic hand-painted sign above the door. You're also carrying more debt than you should be for a business this solvent because you haven't raised your labor rates in 2 years. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. I looked at the public filings, she said, almost apologetically. It's what I do. I look at numbers. I don't... He tried to find the sentence. I don't know what you want from me, Ms. Whitmore. Scarlett. She reached into the interior pocket of her blazer. And what I want is to do something that I'm finding is actually harder than I expected. She held out an envelope. I want to pay you for last night, fairly. For your time, your expertise, and what I'll call the inconvenience premium of being in the rain with your kid in the car. He didn't take the envelope. She waited. I told you last night. I know what you told me. She hadn't lowered the envelope. Mr. Brooks, I have approximately 300 people on my payroll who do nothing but take things from me. Information, time, credit, opportunities. It is genuinely unusual for me to encounter someone who declines something I'm offering. I'm not entirely sure what to do with it. You don't have to do anything with it, Ethan said. I didn't stop to get something. I know you didn't. That's why I'm here. She tilted her head slightly. The people who stop because they want something, I can handle those people. They're predictable. They want money or access or a favor that'll pay out later. I know that math. She paused. You just fixed my car and told me to drive safe. That's what you do when someone needs help. In my experience, Scarlett said quietly, it isn't. The two of them stood there for a moment in the silence of the lot, the sound of the main road a low constant in the background. The morning sun making the puddles from last night's rain look briefly beautiful. Then the door to the waiting room banged open, and Sophie came out with a juice box in one hand and biscuit in the other. Because it was spring break and she was supposed to be reading in the waiting room, but she'd clearly heard voices and decided that was more interesting. She looked at the SUVs. She looked at the people with tablets. She looked at Scarlett. Who are you? Sophie said, with the complete straightforward directness of a child who had not yet learned the social convention of pretending you don't want to know something. Sophie, Ethan said. I'm Scarlett, Scarlett said. Sophie looked at her for a second. You were in the rain last night. I saw you out the window. A bead of something crossed Scarlett's face that she didn't quite manage to keep off of it. You weren't asleep? I was almost asleep, Sophie said with precision. There's a difference. Sophie, Ethan tried again. She's nice, Sophie said to Ethan, as though delivering a verdict she'd arrived at through careful analysis. Then to Scarlett. Are you famous? The woman in the structured blazer made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Scarlett looked at Sophie with the expression of someone who had fielded 1,000 strategic questions from some of the most sophisticated people in the world and was finding this one unexpectedly difficult. Some people know who I am, she said. So yes, Sophie said. Yes. My dad fixed your car. He did. He's really good at fixing cars. Sophie said it simply, without performance, the way you state something that's just true. He fixed Mrs. Okafor's car once, and she cried. Like, actually cried. Because she needed it for work, and she didn't have money to pay him, and he fixed it anyway. Sophie? There was more weight in his voice this time. She glanced at him. What? It's true. The lot was quiet for a second. Scarlett slowly put the envelope back in her pocket. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him, the way she hadn't quite let herself do in the rain when the equation had seemed simpler. There was something happening behind her eyes that she was keeping mostly internal. I'll tell you what, she said. I have a meeting I'm already late for. But I have 5 cars, Mr. Brooks, and they all need regular service. I'd like to bring them here, if you'll take the business. That's all. A business arrangement. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. You don't need to drive 40 minutes to Millhaven to get your cars serviced, he said. You have 12 dealerships within 10 miles of wherever you live that would detail your fleet for you. Probably, she said. But none of them fixed my car in a rainstorm without asking what was in it for them. He studied her face. The challenge in it. The thing underneath the challenge that he couldn't quite read, but that felt real. The way some things felt real before you had the language to name them. All right, he said finally. Bring the cars. Scarlett nodded, once like a deal closed. I'll have my assistant call to schedule. She started to turn. Scarlett? She turned back. He looked at her steadily. For what it's worth, you made it home safe. Something moved across her face. She held it for a second. Yeah, she said quietly. I did. She walked back to the town car. The SUVs followed. The woman in the structured blazer said something into her phone. The whole caravan pulled back out onto Commerce Street and disappeared toward the main road. Sophie stood beside Ethan, juice box in hand, watching them go. Dad? She said. Yeah. She's going to come back. Ethan looked down at her. You can tell, Sophie said, with the unnerving confidence of someone who had once told him, at age 6, that the neighbor's dog was sad. And 3 days later, the neighbor's dog had in fact turned out to be quite sick. He looked back at the empty lot. Finish your juice, he said, and go read your book. She went. He stood there for another moment in the morning sun, surrounded by the ordinary facts of his life. The tools, the oil stains on the concrete, the sign above the bay doors, the particular color of the sky over Millhaven at 9:50 on a Tuesday. He went back under the Silverado, but for a long time, working in the familiar dark beneath the truck, he kept seeing it, the way she'd looked when Sophie said he fixed it anyway. That brief, unguarded moment, like she'd encountered something she didn't have a category for and wasn't sure what to do with the gap. He torqued the last bolt. Outside, somewhere on Route 9, a car passed. Another. The ordinary traffic of ordinary life moving through an ordinary town. He slid back out from under the truck and got back to work. The Bentley came back 4 days later. Ethan was in the middle of diagnosing an overheating issue on a 2019 Ford Escape when he heard the crunch of expensive tires on his lot gravel and looked up to see the Continental pulling in. Alone this time. No SUV escort, no tablet-carrying assistants, just the car and presumably Scarlett behind the wheel. He watched through the open bay door as she parked with more care than the lot actually required, straightened the wheel, cut the engine. She sat in the car for about 10 seconds before getting out. He noticed that. The sitting. Like she was deciding something, or finishing deciding something she'd already mostly decided. She got out wearing dark slacks and a lightweight jacket, her hair down this time, and walked toward the bay without the performance of her first visit. No entourage to manage the optics. Just her, crossing his lot on a Thursday morning like it was something she did regularly. The assistant was supposed to call, Ethan said. I told her not to. Scarlett stopped at the edge of the bay, hands in her pockets. Is that a problem? He looked at her for a moment. You drive yourself? When I want to think. Where's the security detail? I told them I was going to the dry cleaner. He almost smiled. Almost. And you came here instead. The car needs an oil change, she said, and the way she said it carried the small, specific guilt of someone using a technically true statement to avoid a fuller truth. The Bentley Continental W12 needs an oil change at a 1,000-mile interval minimum, Ethan said. I'd want to see the service record, but I'm guessing you're not 1,000 miles past your last one. She looked at him. Are you going to turn away a customer? I'm going to do the job right, he said. Pull it into Bay 2. She pulled it into Bay 2. He got the service record from her. She pulled it up on her phone, sent it to his email, and he noticed the last oil change had been done 11 weeks ago by a dealership in the city, and the car had barely cleared 400 miles since. He didn't say anything about it. He ordered the correct oil while she settled into one of the plastic chairs in the waiting room, and he noticed she didn't take out her phone the way most people did. She just sat, looking at the small laminated sign above the coffee maker that said, "Out of order." again in what Sophie had written with a black marker after the third consecutive failure, because she'd thought it was funny and Ethan had been too tired to argue. "Your daughter wrote that sign," Scarlett said through the open doorway between the waiting room and Bay 2. She thought it was funnier than a plain sign. She was right. He checked the oil level first out of habit, then pulled the drain plug. "She wants to be a comedian," he said, "or a marine biologist. The list changes. Last month it was a weather forecaster. What do you want her to be?" He thought about it for a second, the way the question deserved. "Happy," he said. "I want her to be happy. Everything else is negotiable." Scarlett was quiet for a moment. "That's a harder thing to achieve than most parents admit." "I know." The oil drained. He worked. From the waiting room came the sound of Scarlett shifting in the plastic chair, which creaked the way all three of the plastic chairs creaked. And he had a strange moment of awareness. One of the wealthiest people in the country sitting on a $7 chair in a waiting room that smelled like motor oil and old coffee, and not appearing to mind. "What was she like?" Scarlett said. The way she said it told him she'd been building toward it, circling. He knew who she meant. He didn't pretend not to. "Claire? You don't have to answer that." "No, it's—" He found the correct wrench. "She was sharp. Funnier than me, which she reminded me of regularly. She had strong opinions about things that didn't seem to matter, and almost no opinion about things that did. She'd spend 45 minutes choosing a restaurant and then order the same thing she always ordered." He paused. "She was a good person. Not in a performing way, just underneath it." "Sophie has her eyes," Scarlett said. He looked up. "From the photographs," Scarlett said carefully. "When I looked up your shop." "You looked at photographs of my family?" "Public records, business profile. I wasn't—" She stopped. "I'm sorry, that was overstepping." He considered her for a second. In his experience, people who said, "I'm sorry," and meant it usually looked slightly uncomfortable with themselves. She did. "It's fine," he said, and meant it, mostly. "Yeah, Sophie has her eyes." He finished the oil change, replaced the filter, checked the levels, inspected the brake pads because he was already in there, and it cost nothing to look. The front left pad was closer to the end of its life than it should have been for a car with this few miles. He made a note. When he brought the car out of the bay, Scarlett was standing in the lot again, face tilted up toward the sky. It was a clear morning, the kind that Virginia did well in late spring, and the sun was doing something specific to the quality of the light that made even the commercial strip of Commerce Street look briefly like something worth looking at. "Front left brake pad is running low," he said. "I can do it today if you want, or bring it back next week. I wouldn't wait past 2 weeks. Do it today. It'll take about an hour. You could have someone pick you up." "I'll wait." So she waited. She bought a coffee from the place 2 doors down and came back and sat in the plastic chair again, and at some point took out a small notebook, actual paper, actual pen, and started writing things in it. And Ethan found himself peripherally aware of her in a way he hadn't been aware of another person in a long time. Not intrusive, just present. Sophie showed up at noon with a peanut butter sandwich for Ethan and the information that she had finished her book report and could she please have screen time now, and she stopped cold in the doorway of the waiting room when she saw Scarlett. "You came back," Sophie said. "I did." Scarlett had closed the notebook. "I told my dad you would." Sophie looked at Ethan, who was wiping his hands at the doorway to Bay 2. "I told him." "You told him," Scarlett agreed, apparently content to be part of this evidence. "Why?" Sophie asked. Scarlett tilted her head. "Why did I come back?" "Yeah." A pause. Adult pause, the kind where you're deciding how much truth fits in the answer. The car needed work. Sophie absorbed this. "Okay," she said, in the tone she used when she didn't fully believe something but was choosing not to push it. She looked at Ethan. "Can I have screen time?" 1 hour. 1.5. 1 hour, Sophie. 1 hour and 15 minutes. Hour and 10, and that's final. She disappeared into the back office with her tablet. Ethan looked at Scarlett, who was watching the space Sophie had occupied with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Something soft that she was handling carefully, like it was fragile. "She negotiates," Ethan said. "I noticed." "Gets it from her mother." He paused. Claire would have gone until she got the outcome she wanted. Sophie's the same. Scarlett smiled, and it was different from the smiles he'd seen at her press events, the ones Sophie occasionally surfaced on her tablet looking for animal videos and hit instead on financial news. Those smiles were crafted, useful, doing work. This one was just a smile. "Sounds like a formidable woman," Scarlett said. "She was," Ethan said. "She really was." He went back to the brake job. Scarlett went back to her notebook. Somewhere in the back, Sophie's tablet produced the sounds of whatever she was watching, and outside on Commerce Street, the ordinary traffic of the town moved through the ordinary hours of the day. By the time Scarlett paid, full price, which Ethan charged, and she didn't argue, it was past 2 in the afternoon. She stood beside the Bentley for a moment with the keys in her hand, and Ethan had the sense that she was again doing the things she'd done when she'd arrived, finishing a decision she'd already mostly made. "I have a Range Rover," she said. "It's been making a sound." "What kind of sound?" "A bad one." "That's not a lot to go on." "I know." She unlocked the car. "I'll bring it by." She came back the following Tuesday with the Range Rover. The sound turned out to be a heat shield that had come loose and was vibrating against the exhaust. A common issue, an easy fix, 20 minutes of work. Ethan was done before he'd expected to be, and Scarlett was still sitting in the waiting room with her notebook when he came to tell her the car was ready. "That's it?" she said. "That's it." She looked briefly, almost imperceptibly, disappointed. He didn't point that out. She paid, said she'd be in touch about the other cars, and left. He watched the Range Rover pull out onto Commerce Street and had a thought that he pushed away before it fully formed. She came back 3 days later with a Mercedes. The Mercedes had nothing wrong with it that he could find after a complete inspection, which he told her, and she received this information without visible distress and asked whether he could do a full service anyway. He could. He did. It took most of the afternoon, and when he brought the car out, she was in the lot talking to Sophie, who had apparently wandered out at some point with a juice box and the information that her dance recital was coming up, and she was going to be a sunflower. "A sunflower specifically?" Scarlett was saying. "All the second graders are sunflowers," Sophie explained. "Miss Delaney said it would be easier with the costumes because we all have the same one, but I told her I wanted to be a daisy." "What did she say?" "She said I could be a sunflower like everyone else, or I could sit down." Sophie considered this. "So I'm a sunflower." "That seems like a reasonable compromise." "It's not a compromise," Sophie said firmly. "A compromise means both people give something up. I just lost." Scarlett looked at Ethan, who had arrived at the edge of this conversation in time to hear the last part. "She's not wrong," Scarlett said. "She's rarely wrong," Ethan said. "It's exhausting." "I'm right here," Sophie said. He handed Scarlett the keys. "Car's good. I could have told you on the phone." "You could have," she said. They looked at each other for a second. The afternoon light was doing the specific thing it did in May, low and generous, and somewhere down Commerce Street someone was cutting grass, and Sophie was watching them both with the focused attention of someone who was gathering data. "Sophie," Ethan said, "go inside." "I'm not in the way." "Inside, Soph?" She went, but slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone who wanted it noted that they were complying under protest. The waiting room door closed behind her, though Ethan had no doubt she was at the window. He looked back at Scarlett. "You know you don't have to bring a car into—" He stopped, tried again. "You could just come by." She looked at him steadily. "To do what?" "Talk." He felt the slight awkwardness of the word and didn't run from it. "You seem like you don't do that a lot. Talk. Without it being about something." Something moved across her face, complicated. "I have a lot of people around me." "That's not the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. Behind them, a car passed on Commerce Street, and someone honked at someone else for reasons that remained unclear, and the grass-cutting smell drifted by and then faded. "I'm not good at—" she started, stopped. "People generally want something from me, even the ones who like me, especially the ones who like me. There's always a door they're trying to get through." "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to get through any doors." "I know you're not," she said. "That's what I don't know what to do with." He looked at her. The honesty of it was slightly startling. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. Just a person admitting a true thing plainly, without packaging it. "Well," he said, after a moment, "the coffee maker in the waiting room doesn't work, but there's a decent place 2 doors down, if you wanted, sometime." The corner of her mouth moved. "I'm aware of the place 2 doors down." "Right. You're asking me for coffee." "I'm offering coffee," he said, "in the general vicinity of the shop, because you're here often enough that it might as well be intentional." She looked at him for another second. Then she looked down at the keys in her hand. "I have a call at 4, she said, "and then another at 5:30. "Okay. But I could move the 4 o'clock. He nodded. "Coffee's cheap." "I'm aware of the price of coffee, Ethan." It was the first time she'd used his first name. Neither of them mentioned it. They walked down to the place 2 doors down and sat at the small table by the window and drank coffee for an hour and 15 minutes. The conversation moved through territory that surprised him. Not business, not the shop, not her company. She talked about growing up in Richmond in a house where there was never quite enough, where her mother had worked 2 jobs and her father had been absent in the particular damaging way that absent fathers were. She talked about the scholarship that had gotten her to college and the idea she'd had at 22 that had become, through a combination of obsessive work and several pieces of luck she was honest about, the beginning of Whitmore Industries. She talked about the way success had changed the room around her without changing her, and how for a long time she hadn't noticed, and then one day she had, and by then the room had been different for years. He talked about Claire, more than he'd talked about her in a long time, more than he usually permitted himself. He talked about the first year after, the specific mechanics of grief combined with the specific mechanics of solo parenting an infant, which left no time for the grief to breathe, which was in some ways a mercy and in other ways a postponement. He talked about the gradual settling of things, the way Millhaven had become home not because it was what he'd planned, but because it was where he'd stayed, and staying had its own kind of meaning. She listened the way very few people listened, not waiting for her turn, not preparing her response while he was still speaking, actually listening. The coffee place had exactly 3 other customers during the hour, and 15 minutes they were there, and not one of them recognized Scarlett Whitmore, which might have been because she was sitting in a coffee shop in Millhaven, Virginia, or might have been because the version of herself she was presenting that afternoon looked so different from the woman on the magazine covers that there was simply no frame of reference. She looked, Ethan thought, like a person. He said that, on the walk back to the shop. He said it without thinking and immediately knew it had come out wrong. I didn't mean, "No," she said. "I know what you meant." It came out strange. "You meant I seemed like I was off the clock." Something like that. She was quiet for a pace or two. "I don't get that a lot," she said. "To just be a person. You should get it more." She looked at him sideways. "You're very straightforward. Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It's genuinely unusual. But no." They were back at the lot. The afternoon had shifted, the light going from generous to something more complex, the shadows extending. Inside the shop, Ethan's last appointment of the day was due in 40 minutes. Scarlett unlocked the Mercedes remotely. The lights blinked. "The other 2 cars," she said. "What about them?" "They both need service." He looked at her. "Do they?" She met his eyes without flinching. "Probably not urgently," she admitted, "but they'll need it eventually." He nodded slowly. "I'll be here." She got in the car. He stood on the lot and she rolled the window down. "Ethan." "Yeah." She seemed to be looking for the right words and not quite finding them. "Thank you," she said finally. "For the coffee." $2.40, he said. "Don't mention it." She smiled. That real one again, the one that didn't look like it was performing anything. Then she put the car in reverse and backed carefully out of the lot and turned onto Commerce Street and was gone. Ethan stood there for a moment. The grass-cutting smell had faded entirely now. A truck rumbled past on the main road. Somewhere behind him, Sophie had come back out of the back office and was watching him from the doorway of the waiting room. "You went to get coffee," she said. "We went to get coffee," he said. "I told you to stay inside." "I was inside." I was looking out the window. That's still inside. He turned around and looked at his daughter. She was holding Biscuit by one ear, studying him with the look she got when she was processing information and hadn't finished yet. She makes you talk different, Sophie said. What does that mean? Like when I was little and you used to read to me at night. Your voice was different than daytime voice. She tilted her head. She makes you use that voice. He didn't have a ready answer for that. He almost made a joke, or deflected, or did any of the things he usually did when his daughter wandered too close to something true. Instead, he just stood there on the lot in the late afternoon light, and his daughter looked at him with those familiar eyes. Claire's eyes, sharp and patient, and already knowing the answer to the question she was asking. And he didn't say anything at all. Eventually he said, "Go wash your hands. I'll figure out dinner." She went. He stood there alone for a moment more. Down the street, the Bentley visit, the Range Rover visit, the Mercedes visit. They organized themselves in his memory in a sequence that suddenly seemed less accidental than it had each time individually. He thought about the way she'd looked in the waiting room with her notebook. He thought about her listening face. He thought about the things she'd said, "I don't know what to do with it," and the honesty of it, the small courage it had taken to just say the true thing plainly. He thought, "She'll bring the other two cars." He thought, "I'll be here when she does." Then he went inside because Sophie needed dinner and the day wasn't done yet, and Ethan Brooks had been getting through days for long enough to know that you did it one piece at a time. The fourth car came the following week, a Tuesday again, and she didn't pretend the Porsche Cayenne needed anything beyond a tire rotation that she could have gotten anywhere. He didn't pretend not to notice. He did the rotation and came out of the bay and said, "Dinner," without preamble, which was even more abrupt than asking someone for coffee, and he knew it. She looked up from the plastic chair. "What?" "Dinner. Not here, obviously. There's a decent Italian place on Merchant Street, nothing fancy, but the food is actually good and it's quiet on Tuesday nights." He paused. "Or not, if that's—" "What time?" she said. 7. "I'll get someone to stay with Sophie." She looked at him for a second. That measuring look, but different from the way she'd used it the first time she'd walked onto his lot. Less assessment, more something else. "You've never done this before," she said. "Asked someone to dinner. Recently, I mean." He considered lying about this, then didn't. "No." "Neither have I," she said. "Asked anyone, or said yes." "Okay." 7, she said. 7. She left at 5:30. Ethan went inside, called his neighbor Mrs. Okafor, who owed him about 100 favors and never kept count, and asked if she could sit with Sophie for a few hours. Mrs. Okafor said yes before he'd finished the sentence, and he was fairly certain from her tone that she was going to want a full debrief, which he was not going to give her. He told Sophie he was having dinner with a friend. Sophie looked up from her homework with perfect, terrible 8-year-old precision. "Scarlett?" "A friend," he said. "Is Scarlett not a friend?" "Sophie." "I'm just asking clarifying questions," Sophie said, with an innocence so studied it was practically criminal. He showered and changed into the nicest thing he owned that didn't look like he was trying too hard, which was a dark blue button-down he'd bought for a cousin's wedding 2 years ago and hadn't worn since. He drove to Merchant Street and Scarlett was already there, at a corner table, and she'd beaten him by 5 minutes, which told him she'd been uncertain about being late. She was wearing something simple, dark green, nothing elaborate, and she looked like herself. Not the cover of Forbes version, just herself. They talked for 3 hours, not about business, not about the shop, about the things that came up when two people who were each, in their different ways, used to keeping most of themselves private decided to see what happened if they didn't. She talked about the board of directors who didn't take her seriously until the company's second year of profitability, and the specific exhaustion of proving yourself to people who had already decided the answer. He talked about the loneliness of Millhaven in winter, the way a town could feel like the only place on earth and also like no place at all. She talked about her apartment in the city, which had been designed by someone expensive and felt like a hotel she lived in. He talked about the yellow room. "Sophie chose the color," he said. "Of course she did." "It's aggressive," he said, "in daylight." "Does it bother you?" He thought about it. "No," he said. I think I'd miss it if it were different. She looked at him over the rim of her water glass. That's a very specific kind of love, she said. The kind where you love the thing even though it's a lot. He looked back at her. Yeah, he said. It is. The restaurant was quiet, the way she'd said it would be. A few other tables, low music, no one looking at them. She seemed to decompress incrementally through the meal, tension leaving her shoulders by slow degrees. And he found himself watching the process with more attention than he'd intended. When the check came, he reached for it. Ethan. The tone was a warning. I asked you to dinner. I own a company worth. I asked you to dinner, he said steadily. She looked at him, then she moved her hand away from the check. This is going to be a recurring thing, isn't it? She said. You doing things the way you're going to do them regardless of the math. Probably, he said. I find that frustrating, she said. And also, she paused. I don't know, something else. I know, he said. Outside the restaurant on Merchant Street, they stood for a moment in the cooling night air. The street was quiet, a few cars, the ordinary sounds of a town winding down toward 9 o'clock. I keep coming back to the shop, she said. I want to be clear that I know what I'm doing. Okay. I'm not confused about it. Okay. She stopped, started over. This is not something I do, whatever this is. I know, he said. Me neither. She looked at him for a long moment, and the streetlight was doing something complicated to the shadows on her face, and he thought about what Sophie had said about voices. I'll see you at the shop, she said finally. I'll be there, he said. She walked to her car. He walked to his truck. He sat for a second before starting it, the same way she'd sat in the Bentley the first time she'd come back, finishing something, or starting something, or not being entirely sure which one it was. He started the truck and drove home. Mrs. Okafor was on his couch watching television, and Sophie was in bed, theoretically asleep. He thanked Mrs. Okafor, who gave him a look that asked 100 questions and accepted his silence with approximately no grace, and walked him to the door with the specific energy of someone who intended to follow up. He checked on Sophie, the yellow room, in the dark, biscuit in the crook of her arm, the slow rise and fall of her breathing. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. He thought about Claire. He did that less often than he used to, or maybe more precisely. It was less like drowning and more like looking at something a long distance away, something real and solid, but no longer close enough to block the light. He thought she would have had opinions about all of this. Strong ones. She would have made him describe the dinner in specific detail and then told him what he'd actually meant by everything he'd said, and she probably would have been right. He thought, I don't know what this is yet. He thought, I don't have to know yet. He pulled Sophie's door almost closed, leaving the inch of light she liked, and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter in the quiet house. And outside the window, Millhaven was dark and ordinary, and entirely itself. And the night held nothing remarkable except the strange, persistent warmth of a feeling he hadn't expected and hadn't gone looking for and didn't, for the first time in a long time, feel the need to immediately put somewhere safe. He let it be there. Then he went to bed because morning came regardless, and he had a full schedule, and life in its ordinary machinery did not pause for feelings any more than it paused for anything else. But it was there. Whatever it was there. The fifth car never came. Not because Scarlett ran out of cars, she had two more, a Jaguar F-Pace and an Aston Martin that she'd mentioned in passing at dinner the way other people mentioned umbrellas, but because somewhere between the fourth visit and the week that followed, they both quietly stopped pretending the cars were the point. She called instead. Not a text, an actual phone call, on a Wednesday evening when Ethan was washing the dinner dishes and Sophie was doing homework at the kitchen table with the focused intensity she applied to math and absolutely nothing else. He saw the name on the screen and dried his hands before answering, which he noticed himself doing and chose not to analyze. Hey, he said. Hey. A pause. Is this a bad time? No, Sophie's doing homework. Is she actually doing homework, or is she doing that thing where she has the homework in front of her and she's thinking about something else? He looked at Sophie, who was chewing her pencil and staring at a point approximately 6 inches above her worksheet. "The second one," he said. He heard her laugh, small and genuine, and something in him registered it the way you register a sound you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. He didn't track it consciously. It was Sophie saying, "Dad." I finished that made him look at the clock and feel the mild shock of where the time had gone. After he'd gotten Sophie through her bath routine and into bed and come back to the kitchen, he sat at the table for a while in the quiet house and thought about the fact that an hour and 20 minutes had passed, and he hadn't once been aware of time moving. That was new. She called the next Wednesday, and the one after that. The Wednesday calls became a thing, not discussed, not formalized, just the shape the weeks started to take. He'd finish dinner, get Sophie settled, and at some point between 8 and 8:30 the phone would ring, and they'd talk until one of them had something early the next morning. On the third Wednesday, she told him about a board meeting that had gone badly. Not the details. There were things she kept in a compartment that he respected without being asked to, but the texture of it, the specific exhaustion of being right about something and having to prove it anyway. The way certain men in certain rooms looked at her when she spoke, a look she'd been fighting since she was 23, a look she'd gotten very good at navigating while never entirely stopping it from costing her something. Do you ever think about just... He tried to find the shape of what he meant. Just stopping? Stopping what? Running the company? All of it. The proving, like, just... He paused. Just being done, needing them to get it. She was quiet for a moment. I think about it. And then I think about the fact that the minute I stop, they'll say I stopped because I couldn't handle it, so I don't stop. That's not a good reason to keep going. No, she said, but it's the real one, at least part of it. And I'd rather know the real reason than make up a better sounding one. He respected that. He told her so. You do that a lot, she said. What? Just say the thing, like, I respect that, straight out. A pause. Most people dress it up more. Most people are stalling, he said. Takes more energy than just saying the thing. She laughed again. He was starting to collect those laughs the way you collect certain small objects. Not deliberately, but you notice at some point that you have them and don't want to put them down. It was Sophie who first called it what it was. This was in late June, on a Saturday, when Scarlett had come by the shop not for a car but openly, showing up at 10 in the morning in jeans and a plain white shirt with coffee from the place 2 doors down for both of them. And she and Ethan had sat on the folding chairs outside the open bay door in the sun and talked while the shop had its slow Saturday morning. Sophie had been inside with Biscuit and her drawing pad, allegedly drawing, but she appeared in the doorway at some point with the drawing pad in hand and sat cross-legged on the concrete between the two of them and started drawing without commentary. After about 15 minutes, she held up the drawing pad. She'd drawn 3 figures, a tall one, a medium one, a small one. The small one was holding something that might have been Biscuit or might have been a cloud. Her artistic ambitions occasionally exceeded her technical execution. All 3 figures were in a row. That's us, she said. Ethan looked at the drawing, looked at Scarlett, looked back at Sophie. Scarlett was looking at the drawing with the careful expression of someone who understood the weight of the thing being offered and didn't want to handle it wrong. It's a good drawing, Soph, Ethan said. I know, Sophie said, with the breezy confidence she applied to things she was actually uncertain about. She put the drawing pad back in her lap. Then, to Scarlett, are you my dad's girlfriend? The folding chair Ethan was sitting on was not designed for anyone making sudden movements, and he managed not to tip it, but it was close. Sophie, it's a question, Sophie said. You said I should ask questions when I don't understand something instead of just assuming. That was about science, Sophie. It's applicable. Scarlett's mouth was doing something that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. She looked at Ethan, not for rescue, but checking, some quick private exchange, and then looked back at Sophie. Your dad and I are friends, she said. Good friends. Sophie considered this. Mrs. Okafor is Dad's friend. He doesn't look at Mrs. Okafor like that. Like what? Ethan said. Sophie gestured vaguely. the way 8-year-olds gestured when they didn't have adult vocabulary for something they'd nonetheless observed with complete accuracy. "Like that," she said again, as though the explanation was sufficient. Ethan looked at Scarlett. Scarlett looked at Ethan. The morning sun was coming down on the three of them in front of Brooks Auto on Commerce Street on a Saturday in late June, and somewhere a lawnmower was running, and the coffee was getting lukewarm, and his daughter was watching them both with the frank empirical gaze of a scientist who'd done the experiment and was waiting for the data to catch up with the results. "Go draw something else," Ethan said. "I'm already drawing something else," Sophie said, head already back down. It was another 2 weeks before Ethan said anything. He was aware during those 2 weeks of the precise architecture of his own hesitation. Not fear exactly, or not just fear. Something more considered. Sophie was in the equation in a way that was non-negotiable. Whatever he moved toward, she moved with him, and she was 8, and she'd already lost one person, and the math of that was not simple. He also knew, and this was harder to look at directly, that Scarlett's world was not his world. It occupied a different gravitational field. The logistics of it, the exposure, the kind of life that came with $4 billion and a name that showed up in the business news on a slow week. None of that was the life he'd built in Mill Haven, and the gap between them wasn't just practical, it was structural. He thought about that. He didn't resolve it, but he thought about it honestly, which he figured was the most he could do. What finally moved him wasn't a decision so much as a moment. It was a Tuesday evening, and Scarlett had come by the shop at closing time. She'd been doing that occasionally, and Ethan had stopped pretending to himself that it was casual, and the three of them had ended up eating takeout on the tailgate of his truck in the parking lot behind the shop, because the evening was too good to be inside, and Sophie had declared that eating on a tailgate was the best way to eat, a position she held with evangelical conviction. Scarlett had eaten lo mein from a cardboard container and laughed when a noodle got away from her, and Sophie had explained the entire plot of the dog movie, the one Ethan had promised her the night of the rain, the one she'd eventually watched twice on her tablet, in such exhaustive detail that even the lo mein was finished before she got to the ending. Then Sophie fell asleep. Not gradually, not as a process, just there, then gone. The way she did it sometimes, a switch flipped, leaning against Ethan's arm one moment and fully unconscious the next, biscuit sliding out of her grip. He caught the rabbit, looked down at his daughter. Scarlett was watching from the other side of the tailgate, and the particular thing on her face was something he hadn't seen there before. Not the practiced composure, not even the unguarded laugh. Something quieter and more fundamental, like a person standing in a place they hadn't expected to feel like anywhere significant, and realizing they were wrong about it. "She does that," he said quietly. "Just drops." "I know," Scarlett said. "I've seen it." He looked at her. The evening light was exactly what it was. Just light, at the end of a Tuesday, in a parking lot behind an auto shop in a medium-sized town in Virginia. Nothing staged about it. Nothing curated. "Scarlett." He said her name and then didn't immediately continue. She waited. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to be straight with you about that. It's been a long time and I'm probably—" He stopped. "I'm probably going to do things wrong. Ethan, I have Sophie," he said, "and she comes with me everywhere. That's not a condition or a caveat. It's just what's true. I know that. And your life is—" He searched for the word. "Your life is enormous. Mine is small. I don't mean that as a complaint. I mean it as a fact that doesn't change." Scarlett was quiet for a moment. Sophie breathed between them, deeply asleep, the way only children slept. "You think I don't know what I'm doing," Scarlett said. Not accusatory, just identifying the thing. "I think you might not have thought through all of it. I run a $4 billion company," she said. "I think through things. That's different." "Is it?" She looked at him directly. "Ethan, I've been coming to this parking lot and your waiting room in a coffee shop 2 doors down for 2 months. I've rearranged my schedule around a Tuesday phone call. I know what I'm doing." He looked at her, the honesty of it. Again, the thing she did where she just said the true thing plainly. "Okay?" he said. "Okay?" "Okay," he said. "I just, Needed to say the hard things first, before anything else. She nodded slowly. I know, I actually... A pause. I appreciate that more than you know. Most people don't say the hard things first. Most people are hoping they won't have to say them at all. And you? I've learned they don't go away, he said. You might as well get them on the table. Sophie made a small sound in her sleep and adjusted against his arm. They both waited, held still, but she didn't wake. Scarlett looked at him across his daughter's sleeping weight. So what now? She said. I don't know exactly, he said honestly. But I'd like to find out. She held that for a second. Then she nodded. Me too, she said. It wasn't the kind of moment that resolved into something clean and cinematic. Nothing swelled. Nobody kissed in a parking lot behind an auto shop with leftover lo mein on the tailgate. He drove Sophie home and got her into bed, and Scarlett drove back toward the city, and the thing between them existed in the space between defined and undefined that was uncomfortable, but also, Ethan was finding, kind of necessary. Some things needed time to earn their names. What changed was small but consistent. She came to Millhaven more. He drove to the city twice, leaving Sophie with Mrs. Okafor, and Scarlett showed him parts of her life he hadn't seen. An early morning meeting, she let him sit in the lobby of the neighborhood where she'd grown up in Richmond, a small gallery she loved that nobody would have guessed, from looking at her office, that she loved. She was different in the city, slightly, the way everyone was different in the context they'd built for themselves. More efficient, more contained. But she was also still the person who listened the way she listened, and he found that he was more interested in that continuity than in the differences. Sophie's dance recital was the 14th of July. Ethan had mentioned it to Scarlett on the phone the week before, not as an invitation, just in the course of describing what the week looked like. And Scarlett had said what time in the straightforward way she asked for things she wanted, and he'd told her, and she'd said I'll be there and moved on without making it a thing. She was there. She arrived 3 minutes before it started and found the seat he'd saved and sat down. And Sophie, who was backstage in a yellow sunflower costume that Ethan had spent an impressive amount of time affixing correctly, did not see her come in. The recital was the kind of event that was beautiful specifically because it was imperfect. 12 second graders in identical costumes who had been taught a 3-minute routine and who performed it with a range of accuracy that had nothing to do with effort, and everything to do with the fact that they were 8. Sophie was near the left end of the row, and she was mostly in sync and completely focused, brow furrowed with the concentration she applied to things that mattered to her, and for about 45 seconds in the middle of the routine, she was perfectly precise, and Ethan felt the specific parental thing that was too large for the moment it happened in. He looked sideways at Scarlett. She was watching Sophie. Her hands were in her lap, and she was leaning forward slightly, and her face was doing the thing it had done in the parking lot the evening Sophie had fallen asleep. That quiet, unguarded thing. Like she was somewhere she hadn't expected to be moved, and was being moved anyway. She caught him looking. Didn't look away. After the recital, Sophie found them in the lobby, still in the sunflower costume, headpiece slightly askew, and launched herself at Ethan with the full-body velocity of a child who had just performed in public and survived. He caught her, spun her once. I saw you mess up the third count, he said. I recovered, she said firmly. You recovered well, Scarlett said, and Sophie turned to look at her, and the look that crossed Sophie's face was something Ethan didn't have a word for. Surprise and pleasure and something more complicated. Some version of calculation that he suspected Sophie herself couldn't have named. You came, Sophie said. I said I would. Sophie looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Ethan. Then back at Scarlett. You can come to things, Sophie said, with the tone of someone issuing a verdict from a position of some authority. If you want. You don't have to ask. Ethan watched Scarlett receive that. The care with which she took it in. Thank you, Sophie, Scarlett said. The costume is itchy, Sophie announced, which was apparently all she had to say on the matter, and she grabbed Ethan's hand and started pulling him toward the exit, where she'd spotted a girl from her class. Ethan glanced back at Scarlett, who was standing in the school lobby amid the crowd of parents and programs and discarded sunflower headpieces. She looked like she'd been handed something she'd been careful not to want, and was now dealing with the problem of having it. He understood that feeling. He was living it. The harder part came in August, and it came from outside. He was at the shop on a Wednesday morning when a woman he didn't recognize walked in, and he registered her before she said anything. The press credentials around her neck, the particular focused look of someone who'd found what they came for. She was a reporter from a site he vaguely knew, the kind that covered business and wealth and the private lives of people who'd made the news for other reasons. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "I'm Alicia Donnell. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your relationship with Scarlett Whitmore." He looked at her for a second. "There a car I can help you with?" he said. "Mr. Brooks, I think our readers would be very interested in—" "I do brake jobs, oil changes, and engine diagnostics," he said pleasantly. "If you've got car trouble, I'm your guy. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to let me get back to work." She left a card. He put it in the trash. He called Scarlett that afternoon, not waiting for Wednesday. She picked up on the second ring. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. Someone on my team, there was a sighting, I think, and it got to someone it shouldn't have. I should have warned you." "Warned me about what exactly?" "That this was coming." A pause. When I'm seen consistently with the same person, it becomes a story. I've managed to keep it quiet for longer than I expected, honestly." "How long do we have before it's actually a story?" "It might already be one." Her voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering something they'd rather not. "My publicist called this morning. There are at least 3 outlets working on something." Ethan sat on the stool by the service desk. Outside, Commerce Street went about its business, completely indifferent to the conversation happening inside Brooks Auto. "What does that mean? Practically?" "It means people will know. About you, about the shop, about Sophie." She stopped on Sophie's name, and he heard the weight she put on it. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I should have prepared you for this better." "I'm not—" He stopped, organized his thoughts. "I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about Sophie." "I know. She's 8. She doesn't need cameras." "I know," Scarlett said again, and the steadiness in her voice shifted, something more raw underneath it. "I've been trying to figure out how to manage it so it doesn't touch her. I have people who can—" "Scarlett." He said her name to slow her down, not to stop her. "Take a breath." A pause. "I'm scared," she said, and it came out plainly, without dress. "That this is the part where it stops being something simple, where the weight of my life lands on yours and you look at the math and it doesn't add up." "Did you decide that for me already?" "No, She exhaled. "No, I'm just telling you what I'm afraid of." He sat with that for a moment. The shop was quiet around him, the familiar smell, the tools on the wall in their specific order, the compressor in Bay 2 still making its noise that he kept meaning to address, all of it solid and ordinary and his. "I'm going to tell Sophie tonight," he said, "that things might get a little louder for a while. Before I tell her, I want to know one thing." "What?" Are you—" He searched for the word. "Are you in this, Scarlett? Not partly, not with a foot out the door. Actually in it." The silence on the line was about 4 seconds. He counted. "Yes," she said. "Okay," he said. "That's it?" "Okay." "That's it," he said. "We'll figure out the rest." He heard her exhale again, and this time it was different. Relief, maybe, or something adjacent to it. The release of a thing you've been carrying in your chest, waiting to find out if it's going to fall. He told Sophie that evening, at dinner, in as plain language as he could manage. That some people had figured out that Scarlett came to the shop sometimes, and that some of those people were reporters who wrote about what famous people did, and that there might be some people who wanted to take pictures or ask questions. Sophie processed this with a spoonful of macaroni halfway to her mouth. "Why do people care what she does?" Sophie said. "Because she's successful and people are curious." "That's kind of weird," Sophie said. "She's just a person." "I know." "She's a nice person," Sophie said, with the same simple declarative tone she'd used the first time she'd weighed in on Scarlett's character. People should mind their own business. They should, Ethan agreed, but they probably won't. Sophie thought about this. Is she going to stop coming around? No, Ethan said. I don't think so. Good. She resumed eating, apparently satisfied. Then, can I have more mac and cheese? He gave her more mac and cheese. The evening held ordinary in its shape. He washed dishes, Sophie had her bath, Biscuit was located under the bed where he'd apparently been all day, and the yellow room was yellow, and the house was the house. He called Scarlett after Sophie was asleep. She handled it, he said. How? Said people should mind their own business, and asked for more macaroni. A sound from Scarlett that was half laugh, half something that might have been the beginning of tears, quickly managed. She's something else. Yeah, he said. She is. Ethan. Her voice had gone quiet, the way it did when she was saying the true thing. I know this is complicated. I know I bring a lot. I know the exposure isn't what you signed up for. You didn't sign up for a small shop in Millhaven and a kid who needs extra macaroni either, he said. We both took on a lot. I don't think of Sophie as a lot. I know you don't, he said. That's kind of the whole thing, Scarlett. You know that, right? A pause. Yeah, she said softly. I think I'm starting to. The first article ran on a Friday morning, a week later. He saw it because the woman from the diner down the street texted him a link with 3 question marks. And when he opened it, there was a photograph, not of Sophie, they'd kept Sophie out of it, which he'd been told would be managed and had been, but of him and Scarlett walking back from the coffee place 2 doors down, not touching, just walking mid-conversation. He was in his work clothes. She was in whatever she'd been wearing that day. They looked like 2 people on a sidewalk who were talking. The headline managed to make that somehow significant. He read it once, put the phone down, went back to the transmission he was working on. By noon, he'd gotten 12 texts, including 3 from people he hadn't spoken to since high school, and his shop's phone had rung 4 times from numbers he didn't recognize. He didn't answer the unfamiliar ones. He texted back the people he knew with some variation of, I'm good, thanks for checking in. Mrs. Okafor came by at lunch, not pretending to have a reason, and sat in the waiting room and looked at him. You're okay? She said. I'm fine, he said. The article says, I know what it says. She looked at him. She'd known him for 5 years, watched him figure out single fatherhood from close range, brought soup when Sophie had the flu, and lent her car twice when his truck was down. She was one of the specific kind of friends who didn't need you to explain things. She's good to you? Mrs. Okafor said. Yeah, he said. She is. And Sophie? Sophie told her she can come to things. Mrs. Okafor absorbed this. She nodded, once, the verdict clear. Good, she said, and she got up, patted his arm, and left. He worked through the afternoon. At 4:30, Scarlett's town car pulled onto the lot. Not the Bentley, not a car that needed work. Just the car. And Scarlett, who got out and walked to the bay where he was working and leaned against the doorframe. You saw it, she said. Yep. I'm sorry about the texts, the calls. It'll settle, he said. He looked up from the engine he was working on. Are you okay? She looked slightly startled, the way she sometimes did when a question was about her rather than the situation. She considered. I'm okay. They say anything about you that wasn't true? A few things. Mostly they got the facts right and the meaning wrong, which is what they usually do. She crossed her arms, not defensively, just against the afternoon air. There'll be more pieces. It gets heavier before it gets lighter. Okay. That doesn't bother you. It bothers me, he said. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm saying I know what I signed up for. She looked at him for a long moment, leaning in the doorway of the bay, the afternoon light behind her, the ordinary sounds of Commerce Street in the background. You said that to me, she said, about the girl you dated, that she said she knew what she signed up for and then didn't. I remember. I'm not going to be that, she said. It wasn't a promise made to sound good. It was just the true thing, said plainly, the way she said things. He believed her. Not because she'd said the words, but because he knew, by now, the difference between the words she used carefully and the ones she used to perform. This was careful. "I know," he said. She stayed for another hour, sitting in the folding chair outside the bay while he finished the transmission job, talking sometimes and quiet other times, and the specific texture of it, the easiness of being in the same space, the way silence between them had never been empty, was something he turned over in his mind like a smooth stone. How quickly it had happened, how unlikely it was, how real it felt despite the unlikeliness. Sophie came home from Mrs. Okafor's at 5:30 and immediately went to Scarlett and told her, at length, that a girl in her class had seen the article and asked a lot of questions that Sophie had found annoying. "What did you say?" Scarlett asked. "I said she was my dad's friend and it was none of her business," Sophie said. "Did that work?" "No," Sophie said. But then the bell rang. Scarlett looked at Ethan over Sophie's head. He looked back. "Dinner?" he said. "Yeah," she said. They went inside, the three of them, into the house that smelled like whatever Mrs. Okafor had been cooking at her place next door, and Sophie argued about what to watch, and Ethan started something easy in the kitchen, and Scarlett sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, and then put the notebook away and just sat. And the evening settled around all three of them the way evenings did. It wasn't smooth. Nothing about any of it was smooth. But it was real, and it was theirs, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely calculate, Ethan Brooks moved through the hours of a day and felt, under everything else, a kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with the money in the account, or the jobs on the schedule, or any of the variables he'd spent 6 years managing alone. It was just the thing that happened when the right people were in the room. He didn't say that out loud. He just kept cooking. But he felt it, clearly and without decoration, all the way through to the end of the evening, when the dishes were done and Sophie was asleep, and Scarlett stood at the door putting on her jacket and looked at him. "Same time Wednesday?" she said. "Same time Wednesday," he said. She left. He stood at the door for a moment after her car pulled away, hand on the frame, the night air doing its late summer thing, warm and slightly heavy, smelling like cut grass and concrete still holding the day's heat. He thought, this is the shape of it. Not a grand resolution, not a declaration, just the shape of a life, rearranging itself around something new and finding room and holding. He closed the door and went to check on Sophie, and the yellow room was dark and warm, and everything in it was exactly as it should be. The second article was worse than the first. Not in the facts it got wrong, but there were fewer factual errors this time, which was almost more unsettling because it meant someone had done actual reporting. It was worse in the way it framed things. The headline called Scarlett's relationship with Ethan a mystery romance in quotation marks that managed to be both breathless and slightly mocking. And the piece spent 3 paragraphs on the unlikely pairing of a billionaire CEO and a small-town mechanic in a way that was technically neutral and somehow completely condescending about both of them. There was a photograph this time that Ethan didn't remember being taken. Him and Scarlett on the sidewalk outside the Italian place on Merchant Street from 2 months back, walking out after dinner, both of them mid-laugh about something he couldn't reconstruct. It was a good photograph. He hated it on principle. The piece didn't mention Sophie by name. It mentioned sources close to Whitmore who described the relationship as serious and unexpected given her usual social circle, which told Ethan that someone in Scarlett's orbit had talked to someone they shouldn't have, and that this was a problem with a human cause somewhere that was going to bother her more than the article itself. He was right about that. She called at 7 in the morning, before he'd gotten Sophie up for school, which was outside their usual pattern, and told him the temperature of things before she said anything. "Someone on my team talked," she said. "I don't know who yet, but I'm going to find out." "Are you okay?" "I'm angry," she said, with a precision that suggested this was the most accurate available description. "I'm angry because I've been careful. I've been very deliberate about keeping us, in a space where it could just be what it is without being performed for an audience, and someone decided that information was worth something to them. Scarlett, I know." She exhaled. "I know I can't control everything. A pause. "I'm tired of my life being content for other people." He understood that in the specific way that came from having lived through the smaller version of it, the texts, the curious stares on Commerce Street that had started appearing after the first piece, the woman at Sophie's school who'd asked him, with unconvincing casualness, how he knew Scarlett Whitmore while Sophie stood next to him looking at the woman with barely concealed disdain. "Does it change anything?" he asked. "The article, for you." "No," she said immediately. "Then we deal with it and keep going." Just like that. "What else would we do?" She was quiet for a moment, then, "You are genuinely the least dramatic person I've ever been involved with." "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said. "It's a relief. I didn't know it was going to be a relief until it was." He got Sophie up and made breakfast and walked her to the corner where the school bus stopped, which he'd been doing every morning since school started back in September. Partly because it was habit, and partly because there had been a photographer on Commerce Street twice in the past 3 weeks, and he wanted any image of his daughter nowhere near a camera lens. Sophie knew, in the vague way that children absorbed information without being told directly, that there was more attention than usual on their ordinary life. She hadn't complained about it. She'd mostly seemed to regard it as mildly interesting and fundamentally irrelevant, which was, Ethan thought, exactly the right response. At the bus stop, she said, "Is Scarlett coming this weekend?" "Maybe. Why?" "I want to show her the thing I'm making in art class." "What are you making?" "A papier-mâché bowl," Sophie said. "It's not done yet, but it's going to be really good." "How do you know it's going to be good if it's not done?" "Because I can picture it," she said, with the serenity of an artist who'd never been introduced to the concept of gap between vision and execution. The bus came. She got on without looking back, which was a thing she'd started doing in September, and he stood at the corner for a second watching the bus pull away and doing the calculation he always did, the one about how quickly she was becoming someone who didn't need to look back. He found it equal parts good and terrible, the way most things about parenting seem to be. The weekend Scarlett came, she sat at the kitchen table while Sophie showed her the papier-mâché bowl in its current state, which was lumpy and structurally ambitious in a way that its execution hadn't yet supported. Scarlett examined it with the seriousness she applied to things Sophie offered her. "The shape is interesting," she said. "It's supposed to be oval," Sophie said. "It's close." "It's kind of a weird oval." "Organic," Scarlett said, "like something you'd find in nature." Sophie considered this revision. "Yeah," she said, warming to it. "Yeah, it's organic." She took the bowl back with renewed confidence. Ethan was at the counter making coffee. He caught Scarlett's eye over Sophie's head, and she gave him a look that said she was perfectly aware she'd just spun a lumpy bowl into an aesthetic philosophy, and she wasn't sorry. He shook his head. She smiled. It was that kind of Saturday, loose and unplanned in the way that the planned days rarely managed to be. Sophie talked at length. Scarlett listened with the attention she gave everything Sophie said, which wasn't performance, Ethan had long since determined, but genuine. Sophie interested her. The specific way Sophie's mind worked, the particular combination of precision and imagination, the 8-year-old logic that was both completely coherent and entirely its own system. Scarlett was genuinely fascinated by it. At some point in the afternoon, Sophie fell asleep on the couch with a book on her chest and Biscuit balanced improbably on her feet, and the house went quiet in the specific way it went quiet when Sophie was out, a different quiet from when she was just in another room, deeper and more complete. Ethan and Scarlett sat at the kitchen table with their coffee. "Can I ask you something?" Scarlett said. "Yeah." She turned the mug in her hands. "When did you know that things with Claire were serious?" He thought about it honestly. "About 6 weeks in," he said. "We were in the car and a song came on and she started singing and she didn't know I was looking at her and I just knew. Not that it would work out, just that it mattered, that I wasn't going to be unchanged by it regardless of what happened." Scarlett nodded slowly. She was looking at the mug. "Why?" he said. She looked up. "I'm trying to work out what I know," she said, "about this. About us. I don't have a lot of reference points for this kind of thing working. My parents didn't work. Most of the relationships I've watched closely haven't worked. And She stopped. "I've been cautious with things that mattered for a long time, because it was easier than risking them. I know, he said. I'm not being cautious with this, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not holding part of myself in reserve, and that's new for me, and it's a little... She searched for the word. Exposed. He looked at her across the table. Yeah, he said. It is. Does that scare you? Being exposed? Letting someone be exposed with you. He thought about it. The real answer, not the easy one. A little, he said, because I know what it costs if it goes wrong. I know what it costs Sophie if it goes wrong. So yeah, it scares me. But you're doing it anyway. I'm doing it anyway, he said. She held that for a second. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. It was not a dramatic exchange, but it was the truest conversation they'd had yet, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it sat in the kitchen like a third presence, quiet and consequential. What neither of them accounted for was Marcus Hale. Ethan didn't know who Marcus Hale was until the Thursday evening in October, when Scarlett called from the city at 9:15 with the specific vocal quality that she only had when something had happened and she was deciding how to tell him. I need to tell you something, she said, before you see it somewhere else. He sat down on the arm of the couch. Okay. There's going to be a piece, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after, about me and someone I was involved with before. His name is Marcus Hale. He's an investor. We were together for about 8 months, 2 years ago. It ended badly. She paused. He's been talking to someone. I don't know which outlet yet, but the gist of it is going to be that I'm emotionally unavailable, that I used him to improve my public profile, and that I ended things because he started costing me more than he was worth strategically. Is any of that true? No. The word was flat and immediate. Then, partially, the emotionally unavailable part. I was, 2 years ago. I wasn't good at being open with people. I've been working on that. A pause. The rest of it is revision. He's angry, and he has an audience willing to listen because he runs in circles where my reputation matters. What do you need from me? She seemed to pause at that question, like she'd expected something else. I wanted you to know. I didn't want you to see it without context. Okay. He thought about it. Do you want to come here this weekend? Or I can come to the city. Whatever works. You're not... She stopped, started over. You're not going to ask me if it's true? You told me it wasn't. I know I did, but people... Usually there's more questions. Was it actually over? Did I have feelings for him? Is he going to be a problem going forward? Scarlett, he kept his voice even. Did you tell me the truth just now? Yes. Then I don't have more questions, he said. I trust you or I don't. I do. A long pause. Ethan? Her voice had changed, gone quieter, the way it got when she was feeling something she hadn't expected to feel. You can't just... I just did, he said. Come this weekend if you want, or I'll come to you. Either way. She came Friday evening. She arrived at the house, not the shop, which was something that had been changing gradually. The gradual migration from professional territory to personal, from waiting room to kitchen table to the couch, where they'd watch 2 movies with Sophie between them. Sophie asleep before the end of both. Ethan and Scarlett talking in low voices over her about things that had nothing to do with the films. The piece about Marcus Hale ran Saturday morning. It was, as Scarlett had predicted, ugly in its framing. There were quotes attributed to sources who described a relationship pattern and character traits that Ethan recognized as technically constructed from facts arranged to create a false impression. The specific editorial dishonesty that was harder to fight than a lie because it wasn't technically one. Sophie found it. Not on purpose. She'd been looking for something about marine biology on the tablet, and the algorithm had served her something she hadn't asked for, the way algorithms served children things they hadn't asked for. And she came to Ethan in the kitchen holding the tablet with the look she got when she was uncertain how to feel about something. People are saying mean things about Scarlett, she said. Scarlett was at the kitchen table. She had seen Sophie come in, had clocked the tablet, knew what was on it. I know, Ethan said. Are they true? He looked at Scarlett. Scarlett looked at Sophie. Some of it is from things that happened, Scarlett said, but the way it's written makes it mean something different than what actually happened. Sophie frowned. That's lying. It's a kind of lying that's hard to prove, Scarlett said. That's the worst kind, Sophie said, with conviction. Scarlett looked at her. Yeah, she said softly. It is. Sophie put the tablet down on the counter, screen down, like she was putting it away. You shouldn't read it, she told Scarlett. It's just going to make you feel bad, and you can't change it. She then went to find Biscuit, who had gone missing again. Ethan watched Scarlett watch Sophie leave the room. There was something happening in Scarlett's face that he'd seen in variations before, but not quite like this. The complete dissolution of the public-facing composure, not into distress, but into something more fundamental. Like a wall coming down not because it had been battered, but because it had simply become unnecessary. She's extraordinary, Scarlett said quietly. I know, he said. Scarlett stopped. She just handled it, like it was obvious. Just don't read it, you can't change it. 8 years old. She has her mother's instincts, he said. Scarlett looked at him, then she looked at the table. He watched her put her hands flat on the surface, a grounding gesture, something to hold on to. I'm sorry, she said, that this comes with me. The articles, Stop, he said. Ethan, I know what you are, he said. I know what your life looks like. I knew before I said I was in it. He sat down across from her. Are you going to keep apologizing for existing? She looked at him. Because I'd rather you didn't, he said. I'd rather you just be here. That's all I want. You here, in this kitchen, on a Saturday morning, that's the whole thing. She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Sophie reappeared with Biscuit and took in the scene with her particular diagnostic gaze and apparently determined it was fine because she sat down at the table and opened a book without comment. Eventually, Scarlett said, Okay, he said. Across from him, Sophie turned a page without looking up, and the Saturday morning continued, and the article existed somewhere on the internet where articles existed, and in the kitchen on that specific street in Millhaven, the three of them were just people at a table, which was both the smallest and the most significant thing. October became November, and November brought cold and the particular quiet of a town settling in for winter. Scarlett's visits shifted shape slightly, less the spontaneous drop-ins of summer, more deliberate, longer. She stayed for dinner more often than she drove back to the city. She learned where Ethan kept the good knives and which burner on his stove ran hot. Sophie appointed her the official reader of the second chapter at bedtime when Ethan was too tired, a privilege that Scarlett accepted with more solemnity than Sophie's handoff of it warranted. He noticed the way she was in the house, the way she moved in it, no longer with the slight tentativeness of a guest figuring out the right amount of space to occupy, but with the ease of someone who knew which chair creaked and how to get the back bathroom faucet to stop dripping without fully turning it off. He noticed this and chose not to make it a thing, because some things were better as processes than as announcements. What he couldn't control was the board. Scarlett told him on a Wednesday call in November, her voice carrying the particular controlled flatness that meant she was holding something at arm's length in order to describe it. There's a faction on the board that wants me to manage my public image more carefully, she said, meaning they want me to end this. He was quiet for a second. They said that. Not directly. They said, the language was about brand consistency and stakeholder perception, and the way my personal life was creating noise in quarters where Whitmore Industries needed clarity. A pause. Which means end it. What did you say? I haven't said anything yet, she said. The meeting was today. He heard her exhale. I'm telling you first. What are you going to say to them? I know what I'm going to say, she said. I want to know how you're doing with this. Me? This is your life they're talking about managing, she said, and there was an edge in her voice that he recognized. Not anger at him, anger adjacent to him, at something she was being asked to do that she had no intention of doing. You and Sophie. I want to know how you're sitting with the fact that there are people in a room deciding you're a liability. He thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. Annoyed, he said finally, but not surprised. And not, he paused, not going anywhere because some board of directors finds me inconvenient. She made a sound that was quiet and low, something released. Scarlett, he said, what are you going to tell them? I'm going to tell them, she said carefully, that my personal life is not a board agenda item, and that if the company's stakeholders have a problem with who I choose to spend my time with, that says considerably more about the stakeholders than about my choices. That's going to make them angry. I know. Are you okay with that? I've been managing angry board members for 7 years, she said. I'm extremely okay with that. He believed her. The board meeting happened the following Monday. He didn't ask for a detailed account, and she didn't give one, but she called Monday evening and said, "It's handled," in the tone of someone who'd handled it the way she'd intended, not without cost, but without compromise. Anyone resign? He asked. One person threatened to. Did they follow through? Not yet, she said. They won't. How do you know? Because their options for the next position are limited, and they know I know that, she said, without particular satisfaction. Just a fact. He laughed, which surprised them both. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You're just... He didn't finish it. What? Formidable, he said, when you decide something. A pause. Is that... It's a compliment, he said. It's definitely a compliment. December was the month things shifted in the way that felt permanent rather than incremental. It happened on a Sunday, the 14th of December, which was cold in the specific way Virginia got cold in December. Not brutal, but settled, like the cold had decided to stay and wasn't going to announce itself every day. Just be there. Ethan had gotten a tree, a real one, a 7-foot fir from the lot on the edge of town, and it was in the living room in the stand that always leaked slightly no matter what he did, and Sophie had been decorating it for 2 hours with the focused intensity she applied to things she loved. Scarlett had arrived at noon with a casserole dish and the information that she'd been given a recipe by someone on her staff and had made it herself, which turned out to mean that she had made it herself in the way that people who rarely cooked made things, with complete attention, some anxiety, and a result that was technically correct but had been approached with more care than technique. It was good. He told her so. You're being nice, she said. It's good, he said. The bottom layer is a little overcooked, but the rest of it is genuinely good. There it is. You said you wanted honesty. She pointed at him. I said I appreciated honesty. That's different from wanting it. Sophie materialized from the living room. Is the food done? I'm hungry. You were hungry 12 minutes ago when I told you it needed 12 more minutes, Ethan said. That was 12 minutes ago, Sophie said with impeccable logic. After dinner, Sophie went back to the tree. Ethan cleaned up, and Scarlett sat at the counter on a stool and talked to him while he washed dishes, which was a thing that had started happening naturally. The talking while he did domestic things, the ease of it, the specific pleasure of someone's voice in the room while your hands were busy. At some point, Sophie appeared in the doorway. I can't reach the top, she said. I'll get the step stool, Ethan said. Scarlett's taller, Sophie said, with the pragmatism of a person selecting the most efficient tool. Scarlett looked at Ethan. He made a gesture. Go ahead. She went to the living room. Ethan dried his hands and followed, and stood in the doorway. Sophie was holding out a star, an old one, the kind with the gold foil peeling at one point, listing slightly to the left because of a bend in one of the points that Ethan had never quite gotten straight. Claire had bought it at a drugstore in the first year they were together, 3 months after they'd started dating, at a store that didn't exist anymore. Sophie didn't know that. She just knew it was the star, and it went on top and it always went on last. She was holding it out to Scarlett. Scarlett looked at it. Then she looked at Sophie. Something moved through her face. The recognition, maybe, of what was being asked, of what the star might represent, of the weight of being the one handing it up this year. You sure? Scarlett said quietly, just to Sophie. Yeah, Sophie said. You're tallest. Scarlett took the star, carefully, both hands. She reached up and fixed it at the top of the tree, adjusted it twice until the bend in the point faced the back where you couldn't see it. She stepped back. The three of them stood in the living room in front of a slightly imperfect tree with a slightly imperfect star on top, and the lights Ethan had already strung made everything warmer than it was. Sophie said, "It looks good." Ethan said, "Yeah, it does." Scarlett didn't say anything. She was looking at the star. Then she looked at Ethan, and the thing in her face was the most unguarded it had ever been. No layer under it, no management. Just a person in a moment that had gotten through every defense she'd ever built without asking permission. He reached over and took her hand. She looked down at their hands, then back up at him. Sophie was already moving back toward the couch, having completed the task, ready for whatever came next with the easy adaptability of childhood. "Okay," Ethan said softly. Scarlett turned to him. Her eyes were slightly bright, which she was choosing not to acknowledge, and he was going to let her not acknowledge it. "Okay," she said. They stood like that for a moment, in the living room, in the light of the tree, his daughter on the couch behind them starting something on her tablet, the casserole cooling on the stove, the old star slightly crooked at the top, all of it imperfect in every way that mattered and perfect in the only way that did. He didn't have the language for what this was yet. He was starting to think he didn't need it. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep and the tree lights were still on because he always forgot to turn them off and had stopped fighting the fact, he and Scarlett sat on the couch in the quiet living room with the distance between them that had been gradually closing for months and was, tonight, essentially gone. She had her head tilted back against the couch cushion, looking at the ceiling or at nothing in particular. He was looking at the tree. "My board thinks I should be more strategic," she said. "About what?" "About this." She didn't gesture, didn't need to. "What do you think?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think strategy is what you use when you don't know what you want," she said. "And I know what I want." He looked at her. "Yeah?" She turned her head to look at him, and they were close enough now that the distance required to see each other's faces was not much at all. "Yeah," she said. He didn't say the thing he was thinking. He didn't have to. She already knew it, the same way she always seemed to know the things that sat just underneath the words, the things he was slow to say out loud. She reached over and laced her fingers through his, the same way he'd taken her hand at the tree, and they sat like that in the light of the December tree in the house in Millhaven. Outside, Commerce Street was quiet. The cold had settled. Somewhere a door closed, somewhere a car passed, and the ordinary world continued its ordinary turning. Inside, nothing was different, and everything was. The star was slightly crooked at the top of the tree, and neither of them moved to fix it, and after a while the only sound was the house breathing around them, and his daughter sleeping in the yellow room at the end of the hall, and that was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, exactly everything. January was the month Ethan finally fixed the coffee maker. It had been broken for the better part of a year, a fact that Sophie had immortalized on the laminated sign above it, and he'd been meaning to replace it since the previous winter and kept finding other things that needed the money more. But on the second Saturday of the new year, he drove to the hardware store and bought a decent machine, nothing expensive, nothing that required any particular expertise to operate, and installed it in the waiting room while Sophie supervised from the plastic chair nearest the window. "The sign has to stay," Sophie said. The sign was for the broken machine. "It's funny even if the machine works. It doesn't make sense if the machine works." "It makes it funnier," Sophie said, with the confidence of someone who had thought about comedy more than most 8-year-olds. "Because you expect the machine to be broken, and then it isn't. That's irony." Ethan looked at her. "Where did you learn what irony was?" "Scarlett." He installed the coffee maker. He left the sign. Scarlett had started spending more time in Millhaven than she spent in the city, which was a development that had happened so gradually that neither of them had made an announcement about it. It was more like weather changing than like a decision. Incremental, atmospheric, something you noticed after the fact rather than as it was happening. Her assistant called the shop one morning in early January to schedule the Jaguar for service, which made Ethan realize the Jaguar had never actually come in. And he also realized, standing at the service desk with the phone in his hand, that the fifth car had become something of a running private joke between them. The cars had gotten them started. They didn't need them anymore. He mentioned this to her that evening. "The Jaguar genuinely needs service," she said. "Does it?" "The left rear tire has a slow leak." You could go anywhere for a slow leak. I know where I prefer to go, she said. He didn't argue with that. She brought the Jaguar in Tuesday morning. Slow leak confirmed. A nail, not a valve, straightforward repair. He had it done in 35 minutes. She sat in the waiting room with the new coffee maker and the irony sign and her notebook. And when he brought the car around, she looked up from whatever she was writing, and there was a moment, just a second, ordinary as anything, where she was just a person looking up from work, and he was just a person who'd fixed a tire. And between them was the easy recognition of two people who'd stopped being strangers without quite identifying the moment it happened. Good coffee, she said, gesturing at the cup. New machine. I know, Sophie texted me a picture of it. She texted you. She texts me fairly regularly, Scarlett said, with the tone of someone who found this both surprising and not surprising at all. Mostly about biscuit and marine biology. She sent me a 17-second video of a mantis shrimp last week. Ethan stood at the edge of the waiting room, trying to identify the exact feeling that came with the information that his daughter and the woman he was in love with had a text correspondence about crustaceans and stuffed rabbits. It was a feeling that didn't have a clean name. Somewhere in the neighborhood of this is real, and I didn't expect this, and something else underneath both of those that was simply warmth, uncomplicated and direct. He hadn't said in love with out loud. Not yet. He'd been thinking it since approximately November, turning it over with the care he gave to things he wasn't ready to put down somewhere permanent, making sure it was what it actually was, and not something his own loneliness had constructed to look like it. It was what it actually was. He'd been sure since the night of the Christmas tree, standing in the living room watching Scarlett put the star up, her hands careful on the peeling gold foil, the look on her face when she'd stepped back. He just hadn't said it yet. She didn't tell me she was texting you, he said. She probably thought you'd make it weird, Scarlett said, going back to her notebook. He stood there for a second. Would I have made it weird? Scarlett looked up. A little, she said. You overthink things sometimes. I think about things carefully. That's a kind way to describe it. He looked at her. She looked at him. The fluorescent light in the waiting room had a slight flicker that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, and the plastic chairs were still the same plastic chairs, and the coffee maker was new, but the sign was old, and everything was exactly what it was. Small, ordinary, imperfect in its specific ways. And Scarlett Whitmore was sitting in the middle of it like she'd always been there. I'm in love with you, he said. The notebook stayed where it was. Scarlett went very still. He hadn't planned to say it then. There was no orchestrated moment, no setup. It had simply become the true thing that needed to be said, and he'd said it the way he said things, directly, without the dress rehearsal. She looked at him for what felt like a long time, but was probably 6 or 7 seconds. Okay, she said. He almost laughed. Okay. I mean, she put the pen down. I mean, yes. I mean, me too. I mean, She stopped, tried again. I've been in love with you since August, and I've been waiting to see if it was going to go away, and it didn't. August, he said. That's the night with the takeout on the tailgate, she said, when Sophie fell asleep. The way you caught the rabbit. He stared at her. That's what did it. The rabbit. The rabbit and the way you looked at her, she said. I don't know. The whole thing. She picked the pen back up, then put it down again, fidgeting slightly, which he recognized as what Scarlett did when she was feeling something she hadn't fully armored herself against. You looked at her like she was the most important thing in the world that had ever happened to you, and you were also just her dad. And it was just a Tuesday, and I thought... She stopped. What? I thought that's what it's supposed to look like, she said. I'd never seen it up close before. Someone just loving somebody without it being about anything. The waiting room was quiet. Outside, Commerce Street did its usual thing. The coffee maker on the counter did a small settling sound, the kind new machines did. I should have said it in August, he said. You weren't ready in August. Were you? No, she said honestly, but I would have appreciated the company in being not ready. He crossed the waiting room, which took approximately 4 steps given its size, and she looked up at him from the plastic chair, and he took her face in both hands and kissed her. And it was not a perfect movie kiss. It was the kind of kiss that happened when two people who'd been moving toward each other for 8 months finally ran out of the distance between them. Slightly off-center at first, then finding it, his hands not quite steady. When they pulled back, she was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen on her before and recognized immediately anyway. "Finally," she said. "I'm a careful person," he said. "You're a slow person," she said. "There's a difference." Sophie said that too, about the irony sign. "Sophie and I are frequently aligned," she said. He sat down on the chair next to her, and they sat in the small waiting room of Brooks Auto on a Tuesday morning in January, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the best kind of nothing. The interview request came in February. It came through Scarlett's publicist, a nationally broadcast morning program, one of the major ones, the kind that got viewed in real numbers. The premise was straightforward. Scarlett Whitmore at 30, one of the most successful entrepreneurs of her generation, looking back at the year and forward at what came next. Standard territory. She'd done versions of it before. What was different was that the producer had specifically requested in the preliminary email that Scarlett forwarded to Ethan with no comment except thoughts, that the interview touch on her personal life. On the story that had captured public attention, their words, over the past several months. He read it twice. "You don't have to do this," he said. They were on the phone. She'd sent the email an hour before and then waited, which told him she'd already thought about it from multiple angles. "I know I don't have to," she said. "Then why are you considering it?" A pause. "Because right now the story is whoever wants it to be," she said. "The articles about Marcus, the board speculation, the pieces about the unlikely romance and what it means for my brand. All of it is other people's version of something that belongs to us." She paused again. "I want to say one true thing, on the record, in my own words, and then I want it to be done." "What's the one true thing?" He heard her breathe. "That the best decision I made this year wasn't a business decision," she said, "and that, whatever people think about the math of it, the practical math, the optics math, I don't care. I stopped at a repair shop in Millhaven because the car needed it, and I kept going back because I needed to." He was quiet for a moment. "That's more than one thing," he said. "It's one idea with multiple components," she said. "Are you going to mention Sophie?" "No, not by name, not directly." Her voice was careful on this. "She's not mine to discuss in public." "Okay," he said. Are you okay with this? With me doing it?" He thought about it honestly. Not about himself. He'd processed his own feelings about public exposure over the last several months and had arrived somewhere that wasn't comfortable exactly, but was workable, the way a lot of true things were workable without being comfortable. He thought about Sophie, about what Sophie might encounter at school from the girl who'd asked annoying questions, from the particular cruelty that children were capable of when they had material handed to them. He thought about Sophie saying people should mind their own business while turning the tablet screen down. He thought about Sophie appointing Scarlett to read the second chapter at bedtime. He thought about Sophie texting Scarlett videos of mantis shrimp. "Do it," he said. "Say your true thing." She did the interview on a Wednesday in late February in a studio in the city, and Ethan watched it from the shop because the live broadcast fell during his lunch break, and he sat on the stool by the service desk with his phone propped against the computer monitor and ate half a sandwich while it aired. She was in a dark blue dress, composed and present, the version of herself that the world mostly knew, the CEO, the public person, the one who moved through rooms with the kind of authority that other people made space for. The interviewer was good, professional, pushed in the places that were designed to produce something worth airing. About 15 minutes in, she asked the question the whole segment had been building toward. "There's been a lot of discussion this year about your personal life," the interviewer said, "about a relationship that people have found, and I'll use the media's word here, surprising." Scarlett's expression didn't change. "I'm aware. Do you want to address that?" "I want to say one thing about it," Scarlett said, "and then I'd rather move on." "Go ahead." She looked at the camera, not at the interviewer, at the camera, which was a specific choice that Ethan noticed. She was talking to the audience directly, cutting out the mediation. "A year ago I was stranded on a road in the rain," she said, "and someone stopped. He didn't know who I was. He didn't ask what was in it for him. He fixed the car, told me to drive safe, and walked back to his truck." She paused. "I've made a lot of investments in my career. I've built things I'm proud of. But the most significant thing I did this year was go back to that repair shop. Not because I needed the car serviced, because I wanted to see him again." The interviewer nodded slowly. "And the rest of it? The public attention, the commentary?" "People are welcome to their opinions," Scarlett said. "I have work I'm proud of and a life I'm choosing. Both of those things are mine." She looked back at the interviewer. "I'm good with that math." Ethan put the phone down. He sat in the shop for a moment. The compressor in Bay 2 had finally been repaired in December, and the silence where its noise used to be was still sometimes surprising. Outside, Commerce Street went about its Tuesday. A car pulled into the lot. A regular, a Subaru he knew by sound now. And he heard the door and the bell above the waiting room entry, and Mrs. Patterson's voice saying hello to the empty room because Mrs. Patterson always said hello to empty rooms on principle. He went back to work. The response to the interview was something that happened mostly at a distance from Millhaven. Scarlett's publicist sent a summary. Ethan's phone had a day of elevated activity and then settled. The girl at Sophie's school who asked annoying questions apparently watched the clip and told Sophie she thought it was really romantic, which Sophie had reported to Ethan with the specific tone she used for information she found both relevant and mildly irritating. "What did you say?" Ethan asked. "I said, yeah, I know, I was there," Sophie said. He couldn't argue with that. What he hadn't anticipated was the letter. It came in March, addressed to the shop, handwritten on plain paper, from a woman in North Carolina who said she'd seen the interview, and that she was a single mother of 2, and that she'd been having a very hard year, and that something about what Scarlett had said, specifically the part about going back, about choosing to go back, had made her feel less alone. She wasn't sure why she was writing a letter to an auto shop in Virginia. She just wanted someone to know. Ethan read it twice. Then he photographed it and sent it to Scarlett. Her response came in 40 seconds, which meant she'd been near her phone, which at 11 in the morning on a Thursday was not a given. "Can I write back to her?" she sent. He typed, "Yeah." 3 dots. Then, "I don't know what to say." He thought about it for a moment. Then he typed, "Say what's true. You're good at that." A longer pause this time. "I'm better at it than I used to be," she sent. "I had help." He put the phone in his pocket and went back to the engine he was rebuilding. And outside the window, Millhaven was bare and cold, in the specific way it was bare and cold in March. The trees not yet decided, the sky not yet committed, everything in the suspension between what it had been and what it was going to be. He thought about that woman in North Carolina, writing a letter to an auto shop. He thought about how far a thing could travel from where it started, and how you almost never knew, when you were starting it, how far it would go. He thought about a rainy road and a dead battery cable and a woman in a soaked business suit and the specific decision to pull over, which had not felt like a life-altering decision, because life-altering decisions almost never did in the moment. They felt like pulling over, like taking out the toolbox, like just doing the thing in front of you because it was the right thing to do, and your father had told you a long time ago that it stayed with you if you didn't. He thought his father was right about that, right about a lot of things, as it turned out. The proposal, if you could call it that, which Ethan later thought was generous to how it actually happened, was not planned. This needed to be said clearly because Sophie's version of events, which became the official version in her telling, was that Ethan had planned it and that the planning had been elaborate, which was not accurate. What actually happened was a Saturday in April, the weather finally breaking into something warm, the back door of the house open to let the first real spring air through, Sophie in the yard attempting to teach a neighborhood cat named Gerald something, Gerald being largely uninterested in the lesson. Scarlett was at the kitchen table. She'd been working, her laptop open, her phone face up for the calls that came in even on Saturdays. But she'd stopped working about 20 minutes ago and was just sitting, watching the yard through the open door, watching Sophie conduct her curriculum with Gerald, who was sitting in the sun with the magnificent indifference of a cat who had decided to be somewhere and was simply being there. She looked like she was home, not performing comfort, not making herself fit, just At home in the kitchen on a Saturday morning with the spring air coming through, her work sitting open and unattended because this was more important than the work, her whole posture carrying the ease of someone who didn't need to be anywhere but here. Ethan was at the counter making coffee, and he looked at her and had the thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, with a specificity that was new, that he did not want to spend the rest of his life hoping she would keep showing up. He wanted to build something where showing up was just assumed, where the math was different from the math it had been for the past year, which was the math of two people choosing each other day by day in the specific uncertainty of not yet knowing if the choosing would hold. He wanted to know it would hold. He wanted to ask her to make it hold. "Hey," he said. She looked up from the yard. "Hey, I want to ask you something." "Okay." She turned to face him more fully. He put the coffee down. He didn't have a ring. He hadn't been to a jewelry store. He hadn't had a conversation with Sophie about it, though he would, and that conversation would be important, and he knew it would go fine because he knew his daughter. He hadn't done the thing that people did when they planned this. The dinner, the location, the orchestrated moment. He just had the question, and the morning, and the truth of what he was feeling, and those three things seemed like enough. "I want to marry you," he said. "I know this isn't... I don't have a ring. I didn't plan this. I'm standing in my kitchen in a Saturday shirt that has a grease stain I just noticed." He stopped. "But I've been thinking it for a while, and I got to a point where saying it out loud seemed more important than saying it correctly." Scarlett looked at him. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, and she was sitting in it. And outside, Sophie was telling Gerald with considerable patience to sit, and Gerald was not sitting. "You want to marry me," she said. "Yes?" "You." "Yes, Scarlett." Ethan Brooks, who owns an auto shop. "This isn't a complicated question," he said. "I'm processing," she said. "Give me a second." "Take whatever you need." She looked at him. He looked back. He felt standing in his kitchen with no ring and a grease stain on his shirt, absolutely steady. He was 32 years old, and his life was small and specific, and he was asking the person across the room to make it larger, and she was the right person to ask, and he knew it the way he knew engines, not with certainty that nothing could go wrong, but with the certainty that he understood what he was working with. "Sophie," Scarlett said, "I'll talk to her today. This was..." He gestured vaguely. "This happened before I planned to ask, but I was going to ask. I'll talk to her today. She deserves to be in this." "I know she does," Scarlett said. "I wasn't..." She stopped. "I wanted to say her name because she's part of the answer. She looked at the yard where Sophie had apparently given up on Gerald and was now lying in the grass looking at the sky with the boneless ease of childhood. "She came with you. She's not a complication or a consideration I've been working around. She's part of why I'm going to say yes." He let that land, the fullness of it. "You're going to say yes," he said. "I just said yes," she said. "Didn't you hear me say yes? You said you were going to." "That's yes, Ethan." He came around the counter and she stood up from the chair, and he pulled her into him and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the kitchen like that while outside Gerald finally, improbably, sat, possibly because Sophie had stopped asking, and Sophie made a triumphant sound that they could hear through the open door. He told Sophie that afternoon, just the two of them, sitting on the back step in the sun. He was direct, the way he was always direct with her, because Sophie didn't tolerate the cushioned version and didn't need it. He said he wanted to marry Scarlett. He said he wanted to know what Sophie thought about that. Sophie was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that he paid specific attention to it. Then she said, "Is she going to be my mom?" He'd thought about how to answer this. He'd thought about it for a while, actually, in the months since things had become what they'd become, knowing at some level that this question was coming. "Scarlett is Scarlett," he said. "She's not going to be your mom the way Claire was your mom, because that's Claire's and nobody's taking it. But she loves you. She's here. She's not going anywhere." He paused. "What she is to you. You kind of get to figure that out. There's no requirement." Sophie looked at the yard for a moment. Gerald had left. The yard was just the yard. "She comes to things," Sophie said. "She does. She reads the second chapter." She does. She said my bowl was organic. She did? Sophie picked at the edge of the step. Can I still call her Scarlett? You can call her whatever feels right. Okay. She appeared to reach the end of her processing. Okay, then yeah. Yeah? Yeah, you should marry her. She said it like the conclusion was obvious and he'd taken an unnecessarily scenic route to it. She makes you use your night voice in the daytime. He looked at her. 8 years old, sitting in the afternoon sun with grass stains on her jeans and a very direct sense of what mattered. Yeah, he said. She does. Sophie went back inside to find Biscuit. He sat on the step for another minute. He thought about Claire. He did this without guilt now, which had taken time. He thought she would have had a lot to say about all of it, about Scarlett, about the year, about him finally getting out of his own way. He thought she would have liked Scarlett's directness and been fascinated by her, and probably argued with her about something within the first hour. He thought she would have approved, in the way Claire approved of things, not as a gift, but as a verdict, rendered after consideration. He thought, I'm okay. And he was. Not in the flattened way that people said it when they meant the opposite. Actually okay. The grief was still there. It would always be there, tucked into the architecture of things. But it was no longer the loudest thing in the room. The loudest thing in the room was Sophie's voice and Scarlett's laugh, and the sound of a house that had stopped being silent in the ways that mattered. The ring happened 2 weeks later with Scarlett's input, which she provided with the decisive efficiency of a person who knew exactly what she liked and saw no point in pretending otherwise. They went together to a small jeweler in the city, not a grand occasion, just a Saturday afternoon, and she pointed at what she wanted within 5 minutes, which was a simple thing, not large, not flashy, the kind of ring that looked like it belonged to a person rather than to a net worth. He bought it. She wore it home. Sophie examined it with her full attention when they got back. It's not big, she said. Sophie, Ethan said. I didn't say that was bad, Sophie said. Big ones look uncomfortable. Scarlett looked down at the ring on her hand. I think so too, she said. It's pretty, Sophie said with finality. Can we have pasta for dinner? They had pasta for dinner. The engagement became public the following Monday through a brief statement from Scarlett's publicist. 2 sentences, no photograph, no elaboration. The response was, by the standards of things Ethan had seen happen around Scarlett's name, relatively measured. Some enthusiastic, some skeptical. Some of the usual machinery of public opinion processing a thing it hadn't expected. He didn't read most of it. He had a full schedule Monday and Tuesday, a fleet service contract that he'd landed in February, and which was keeping Bay 2 consistently occupied in a way that had stabilized the math in a way he hadn't felt in years. The work was the work. Millhaven was Millhaven. The compressor was quiet, and the coffee maker was new, and the irony sign remained. Marcus Hale put out a statement that said he wished them well, which nobody believed, but which closed the door on that particular chapter in the way that doors needed to close, through the application of social convention regardless of sincerity. The board of directors sent a card. Ethan thought that was genuinely funny and said so, and Scarlett told him he wasn't wrong to find it funny. Mrs. Okafor cried. Not from sadness. She cried from the specific form of joy that some people express through tears, and she held Ethan by both arms in her doorway and told him that she was very happy for him, and that it was about time, and that she expected to be invited to something when the time came, and he told her she was the first person on the list. Sophie made them a card. She drew 3 figures and a cat, Gerald, presumably, and wrote inside in her careful printing, "Congrats on getting married. I think it's a good idea. Love, Sophie." Then underneath, in slightly smaller writing, "P.S. Can we get a dog?" They framed it. It went on the wall in the kitchen. They were married in September, the following year, which gave them time to do it without rushing and without performing. It was small, 30 people. A venue outside Millhaven that had a field and a barn and no pretension about itself. The kind of place that looked like something because it was something, not because it had been designed to look like it. Scarlett wore something simple. Ethan wore the dark blue shirt from 2 years ago, The one from his cousin's wedding, the one he'd worn the night they'd had dinner for the first time, which Scarlett knew and had mentioned when he'd held it up and said this one, and she'd said that one. Sophie was the flower girl, which she conducted with the focused professionalism she applied to things that mattered to her, scattering petals with the deliberate care of someone who had a specific vision for the distribution pattern. She wore yellow, her choice, a yellow that was exactly the color of her room. Mrs. Okafor was in the front row and cried again. The ceremony was short. They'd both been clear about that. No extended readings, no long rituals. They said what they meant and meant what they said, and the whole of it was over in 18 minutes, which Ethan thought was exactly right. Afterward, at the reception in the barn, Sophie found him standing near the edge of the field in the September evening and tugged on his sleeve. "Dad." "Yeah." "Are you happy?" He looked at her. 8 years old last year, 9 now, already a different person in the specific ways children became different people between one year and the next, while also being completely and continuously herself. He looked at her and then out at the field and then at Scarlett, who was across the barn talking to someone from her company, still in her dress, holding a glass of something sparkling, mid-sentence, about something that had made the person across from her laugh. She looked up, across the distance of the barn, and found him. The way she always seemed to find him, some calibration he'd stopped questioning. She smiled. The real one. The one that didn't do anything except be what it was. He looked back at Sophie. "Yeah," he said. "I really am." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said. "Can we get a dog now?" "We've talked about the dog, Soph." "We've talked about it without resolving it," she said. "That's different." He looked at her. He looked at Scarlett, who had caught the tail end of this exchange from across the barn, and whose expression said she'd heard dog and had opinions. "Ask Scarlett," he said. Sophie's eyes lit up with the specific brightness of a child who understood she'd just been handed better leverage. She was off before he finished the sentence, threading through the reception guests toward Scarlett with the focused velocity of a person on a mission. He watched her go. He watched Scarlett look down at Sophie's upturned face, and he watched whatever Sophie said land, and he watched Scarlett look across the barn at him with an expression of deep betrayal, and he gave her the most innocent look he could manufacture, and she pressed her lips together against a smile she didn't quite succeed in suppressing. Sophie said something else. Scarlett looked down at her again. Something shifted in Scarlett's face, the thing it did around Sophie. That specific softening, the thing that had been there since the beginning, since the waiting room and the irony sign, and the first time Sophie had rendered a verdict and handed it to her like a gift. She nodded. Sophie threw both arms in the air. Across the barn, Ethan Brooks stood in the September evening at his own wedding reception and laughed, actual laughter, the kind that started in the chest and didn't ask permission, and the sound of it mixed with the sounds of the party and the field and the late Virginia summer giving its last good warmth, and none of it was perfect, and all of it was his. And that, as it turned out, was more than enough. There were things he'd learned in the year between a rainy road and this barn on this evening that he hadn't known before, or hadn't known clearly. He'd learned that the people who needed you most were rarely the ones who showed up with that written on them. He'd learned that choosing someone wasn't a moment. It was a series of smaller choices, made daily, made in the ordinary hours when nothing dramatic was happening, made in kitchens and waiting rooms and parking lots behind auto shops. He'd learned that being seen, really seen, by someone who had no particular reason to keep looking, was not the same as being loved, but it was the door love came through, and that you had to be willing to be found. You had to be willing to stand in the rain and fix the car and walk back to your truck without making it into anything, and trust that the things you did without an audience were still worth doing. He'd learned that children knew things, specifically that Sophie knew things, that her first assessment of a person was almost always correct, and he should have stopped second-guessing it after the first 3 times she was right. He'd learned that grief didn't end, but it changed, and that change wasn't a betrayal. That you could carry someone with you forward into things they'd never see, and they could still be part of it, not as an absence, but as a shape. The shape of what you'd learned from them, how to love without terms, how to be someone's person all the way, how to let the yellow room be yellow. He didn't think these things in sentences. He just knew them the way you knew things that had gotten into your bones. Not through thinking, but through living, through the accumulated weight of days that hadn't seemed significant while they were happening. What they were, all of them together, was a life. Not a perfect one, not a smooth one, not the life he'd planned at 24 when he'd borrowed the money and painted the sign above the bay doors with more confidence than capital, but his. Completely, messily, specifically his. Across the barn, Scarlett was now holding Sophie's hand, listening to something Sophie was explaining with considerable enthusiasm and significant hand gestures. And she had the look she got, the open one, the one with nothing behind it, the one that had taken 8 months to appear and now appeared whenever she wasn't managing herself. And in the September evening light of a barn in Virginia, she looked like a person who had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. He thought that was probably how it worked. You didn't find the important things by looking for them. You found them on a dark road in the rain when you'd stopped for someone else entirely, and they had a damaged cable connector, and you fixed it because your father told you it stayed with you if you didn't. And you walked back to your truck. And then everything after that was just the question of whether you were willing to stay. He'd been willing. So had she. And here they were, in a barn, in September, while Sophie negotiated for a dog. And the evening held all of it, the ordinary and the extraordinary woven through each other in the specific way they always were, indistinguishable when you looked closely, inseparable when you tried to take them apart. Here they were. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.